Chapter 567. The stray arrows whistled through the sky, but it was more of a deterrent. Under the Crown Prince's powerful suppression, the rebel army did not have the courage to rain down a terrifying rain of arrows on the city walls. Thus, the pressure the imperial army guarding the royal palace faced immediately lessened. They only had to face the problem of contact. Although the sounds of killing shook the heavens below the royal palace, it did not cause any losses to the imperial army. Instead, it was the imperial army stationed in the direction of Taiping Square that faced the greatest danger. However, there were many rebel soldiers at the main gate of the royal palace. At this moment, the thousands of rebel soldiers below the city walls had split into 3 rows and formed 3 black lines that pressed forward. It was truly frightening. Muffled sounds continuously rang out from the 4 corner towers of the imperial city. Every sound would tug at the heartstrings of the crowd, and the entire imperial city would tremble. The strong vibrations represented the strength of the city-guarding crossbow. The giant crossbow bolts pierced through the air like black light and mercilessly stabbed into the rebel army's formation. Countless bursts of blood blossomed and the ground was covered in sticky meat paste. However, there were only 4 city-guarding crossbows, and there were only 2 on the left and right side of the square. How many people could they kill? The rebel army's triple wave charged quickly to the foot of the royal palace without any obstruction. The main target of the city-guarding crossbows was still the military equipment the rebel army used to attack the city, especially the sharp and heavy carriages used to break through the thick palace gates. These carriages had fireblades made from cowhide, and the front end was a giant piece of wood that had been sharpened into a sharp point. They were already very heavy. Once they were pushed at high speed, the impact against the palace gates was very powerful. A crossbow bolt accurately struck a battering ram. The sharp tip easily tore through the seemingly tough cowhide and slammed heavily into the ram. Although the ram was tough and could not be broken by a giant crossbow bolt, the powerful impact of the city-guarding crossbow still caused the ram to jump up. It was like a beetle on the ground that felt the earth shake. Then, it rolled over miserably and crushed a number of rebel soldiers beside it to death. It could no longer move. Within the 3 rows of rebel army charging formation were a dozen heavy and murderous rams. The moment the attack began, the 2 city-guarding crossbows fired with all their might and successfully destroyed 3 of the rams. However, the city-guarding crossbows took too long to reload, and the rebel army's charge came very quickly. In an instant, most of the rams had passed the line of fire of the city-guarding crossbows and neared the 3 main gates of the royal palace. The rebel soldiers shouted in unison, pushing the battering ram as they charged forward with all their might. With a number of teeth-numbing sounds, the rams finally successfully crashed into the thick palace gates. The main gates of the Qing royal palace were very thick. Under such a terrifying crash, they still shook violently. The hinges of the door creaked as if they were about to fall apart. The 4 giant door bolts, which were arranged from top to bottom, were bent out of shape. However, the thick door latch finally withstood this powerful impact, and the creaking sound of the door hinge gradually calmed down. Other than a large dent in the main door of the imperial palace and a dozen or so copper nails falling, everything else was fine. At least, in this attack, the main gates of the Qing royal palace still appeared sturdy and unbreakable. However, the rebel soldiers did not have a trace of a strange expression. Under the stern yells of their superiors, they quickly pulled the first wave of rams away from the palace gates. The rams in the second wave had already passed through the sparse arrows of the imperial soldiers on the city walls. They had escaped the powerful city-guarding crossbows that, like old people, only moved once in a while, and crashed viciously into the palace gates. There was another loud crash. This time, the palace gates had finally received an irreparable damage. The entire gate began to tremble. It gave one a feeling that it was on the verge of collapse. It was as if it could collapse at any moment. The elites of the imperial army who were on standby behind the palace gates led their horses and watched this scene calmly. Although their faces were calm, the anxiety that flashed across their eyes revealed their true feelings. Separated by a thick door, the rebel soldiers risking their lives to launch a powerful attack saw hope that the royal palace would be broken. Their morale immediately rose. With a loud roar, they charged forward again. The 3rd wave of attacking troops arrived. Under the merciless attacks of the imperial army's arrows, boulders, and logs, the rebel army left behind hundreds of corpses. Finally, they succeeded in withstanding the 3rd wave of attacks on the palace gates. With a muffled crack, dust flew into the air. It was like a paper bag filled with smoke had been smashed open by a naughty child's naughty palms. The dust settled slightly, and the field of view became slightly more peaceful. The countless rebel soldiers in the square saw that the thick and heavy palace gates in the middle of the royal palace had been smashed open. They couldn't help but cheer in unison. However, the group of elites closest to the imperial city didn't even have time to release any cheers. Even the excitement and joy on their faces were immediately replaced by shock and anger. They could clearly see that even though a large hole had been smashed open in the palace gate, revealing the thick wooden stubble inside, the entire palace gate showed no signs of collapsing. The ground was covered in golden copper nails. Behind the hole was a thick layer of stone and dirt. There was not a single gap to be seen. The people in the royal palace had blocked the palace gates. Did they not think of leaving a way out for themselves? At this moment, what was the difference between the royal palace and a large tomb? A rebel army officer roared wildly and led the attacking soldiers beside him into the hole. Although there wasn't much space, even if they had to dig open this palace gate. Military orders were like mountains. The Qing soldiers were never cowards who feared death on the battlefield. A long black spear pierced out like lightning from the only gap above the stone and dirt. It pierced the officer's throat, and fresh blood sprayed out. Below the royal palace, 10 paces behind the piles of fake mountains and broken stones in the long palace gates, 300 imperial soldiers calmly and nervously watched for any movement in the palace gates. Their commander had already led a small group in. At this moment they had the advantage of the terrain. There was no reason for the rebel soldiers to attack so easily. Above the royal palace, the great prince watched coldly as the rebel soldiers' attacks grew stronger and stronger. He raised his right arm and brought it down viciously. The soldiers at his side accepted the order and quickly waved the yellow flag in their hands. Along the line in front of the royal palace, the hundreds of imperial soldiers on the palace walls moved at the same time. They lifted the sack at their feet and carefully tore it open. They then scattered it toward the heads of the rebel soldiers, who were no longer within the range of the crossbows. The slightly yellow powder was like dirty snow as it scattered down. In an instant, it enveloped the thousands of rebel soldiers closest to the royal palace. The rebel general paled in shock. He thought it was poison from the Overwatch Council and ordered his subordinates to be careful. It was not poison powder. The third bureau was not Fan Xian's tofu shop. They did not have the ability to produce so much poison. This yellow powder was all crude gunpowder that Fan Xian had ordered taken from the bottom floor of the square building before the imperial soldiers entered the palace in the early hours of the morning. The royal palace had never made preparations to welcome a powerful military attack, so there was no hot oil or anything that could be burned. If it were not for the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian, standing on their side, the battle to defend the city would probably have progressed unusually miserably. The great prince glanced at Fan Xian, who had been calmly watching the rebel army camp in the distance, and gently nodded his head. Fire! The face of the trusted officer who had been following the great prince was full of ruthlessness. He gave the order in a loud voice to all of the imperial soldiers on the royal palace walls. The previously sparse rain of arrows on the royal palace walls suddenly exploded with the most concentrated rain of arrows since the start of the battle. Furthermore, these arrows all carried a red light. It was like the inauspicious color that Qin Heng's valiant general saw before he died under Wangyang Gate. The fire arrows arrived below the walls in an instant. They did not need to be precise. They only needed to shoot into the powder. The sky was beautiful. The autumn sun had risen, and the weather was gradually warming up. The morning wind had already left. The powder that had been scattered down was not blown away by the wind, nor was it blown back up the walls as Fan Xian had been worried about. Instead, it formed a large patch of fog that enveloped the thousands of rebel soldiers below the walls. Looking at the beautiful morning scenery of the willow trees by the riverbank, one could only see the vague figures inside that were beginning to panic. The fire arrows entered the fog. In an instant, they began to burn at a terrifying speed. Countless flames burned vigorously and quickly connected to form a large sea of fire. It was like a fire dragon lying below the royal palace. It was also like a calm lake illuminated by the golden sun. Gradually, waves began to rise and churn. It was extremely bright and scorching hot. It actually covered the light of the sun in the sky. What about the people in the fog? They howled wretchedly and burned, turning into countless pitiful people on fire. They desperately tried to run out of the fog. However, how could such a large area of burning be endured by normal creatures? Countless people on fire ran wildly on the square. Their wretched cries rose into the sky. The scene appeared unusually terrifying. Not a single burning rebel soldier was able to run back to their camp. Most of them had become charred corpses below the palace walls. Some of the burning people on fire only had time to run to the square before falling to the ground with a splat. With the remaining flames and rising smoke on their bodies, they twitched endlessly. Such a scene was extremely tragic. The rebel army camp in front of the buildings in the distance was in a state of panic. Even the Qing army, famed for its strict military discipline, felt fear at this moment. No one had thought that the imperial soldiers guarding the city would have such a terrifying method. The crown prince's face was ashen while the old Qin master looked coldly at the palace walls. Slowly he said, "Only Fan Xian could do such a ruthless method." The smell of burning in the square stimulated everyone's state of mind. Even the imperial soldiers on the palace walls felt a glimmer of fear and helplessness. Looking at the terrifying scene below, some people's lips turned white. They wondered if those charred corpses had all been killed by them. After such a destructive attack, the first wave of rebel soldiers who entered the palace returned dispiritedly. However, there were not many people who returned. The royal palace was finally held by a hair's breadth. However, the rebel army did not carry out a second round of attacks. It was clear that regardless of whether it was the defenders or the attackers, they had all been shocked by this unusually bloody and terrifying fog of fire. They all needed some time to digest and stabilize their morale. However, the instigator of this terrifying fire attack, Fan Xian's expression was unusually calm. He looked at the rebel army camp in the distance and pressed his lips together without saying a word. The great prince saw that Fan Xian's right hand, which was hanging by his sleeve, was trembling slightly. The veins in his eyes were becoming denser and denser. The great prince had not thought that the Overwatch Council's gunpowder powder would have such a terrifying effect. Looking at the scene in front of him, he, who had long experienced the blood and fire of the battlefields of the western region, did not feel any emotions that he should not have. However, he still felt shocked. If this powder could be used like this, what kind of changes would occur in future battles? Today is luck. Fan Xian did not turn his head to look at him. Quietly he said, "There is no wind or rain today. That is why there is such a good effect." Then he slowly lowered his head. Ever since he had taken control of the palace treasury, he had always been very attentive to the joint research work of the Third Workshop and the Third Bureau. In the depths of his heart, he understood why his mother, Yi Qingmei, had put so much effort into other military equipment and people's lives but had strictly forbidden the use of gunpowder in this world. Even when he had saved Xiao En in Shangjing, the Overwatch Council had only provided one cart of gunpowder. The use of gunpowder in this world was still very clumsy. It was even worse than the self-made firecrackers in his previous life. In this world, only Fan Xian knew that even wood shavings flying through the air could cause a large explosion, much less gunpowder powder. Fan Xian couldn't help but worry whether the scene today would open Pandora's box for this land. After a moment, he immediately felt relieved. The palace treasury's steel craftsmanship was not up to standard. There was no need to worry about the arrival of the era of firearms. Furthermore, just as he had said to the great prince, the main reason why the fire protecting the city had such a large effect was because the heavens were on their side. His luck was as strong as before. As for the wretched scene in front of him, Fan Xian actually felt his heart palpitate. Since he was young, he had seen countless corpses and had personally killed countless people. But when he personally saw so many charred corpses appear in front of him, he still felt waves of the urge to vomit. This was a battlefield, a true battlefield. It was precisely because of this that Fan Xian was even more determined to win. If a person came to this world with some kind of mission, he believed that his mission was the agreement with Haitang. If he wanted to reach that agreement, he had to survive today. Using a knife to kill was still killing. Using a gun to kill was still killing. Using gunpowder to burn people to death was also killing. Other than being a bit more terrifying and ugly, there was not much difference. After all, the rebellion this time belonged to a civil war. The two sides fighting were the elite troops of the Qing kingdom. The scene just now made too many people feel a chill in their hearts. The rebel soldiers returned to their camps to lick their wounds, preparing to once again carry the resentment of revenge and begin an even more powerful attack. The expressions on the faces of the imperial soldiers on the city walls were complicated. Many of them didn't even dare to look at the black-clothed Sir Fan Jr. standing coldly on the city walls. The smell of burning and the remnants of fire were still burning in front of the royal palace. The vermilion palace walls and the green bricks on top of the walls were all burned with streaks of color. It looked like this beautiful and solemn royal palace had been ruthlessly slashed with countless scars by a knife. The great prince looked at the scene in front of him and slowly swept his gaze over the imperial soldiers on the city walls. In a steady and firm voice, he said to all sides, "This is war. Remember, those below the walls are rebels. If we allow them to break into the royal palace, the Qing court will descend into darkness. The people will never have a chance to rise again. You will all be crushed to pieces." "What is below the walls?" "It's the enemy," the great prince shouted in a stern voice. "You are all soldiers who have followed me back from the west. Why have we worked so hard to fight the Hu people on the grasslands? Everything is for the Qing kingdom. Those enemies want to destroy the foundation of the Qing kingdom. They are no different from the barbaric Hu people. They are just beasts. I order you from this moment on, you must treat these rebel soldiers as Hu people. Everything is for the Qing kingdom. The emperor is watching you from above." These were not hot-blooded words, but coming from the commander's mouth, they had a surprising effect of comforting people's hearts. The eyes of the imperial soldiers on the city walls gradually lit up, no longer as dim and lost as they had been earlier. "For the Qing kingdom." Everyone on the palace walls cried out. Even the third prince, who was standing by Fan Xian's side, was no exception. Only the Empress Dowager, who had been firmly restrained by Fan Xian, had a glimmer of mockery and panic flash through her eyes. A wave of heavy footsteps rang out on the city walls. A group of eunuchs, under the watch of Overwatch Council officials, carried 3 black coffins with difficulty to the top of the city walls. The coffins landed heavily on the city walls and made a few muffled thuds. Everyone looked at the 3 coffins in astonishment. Fan Xian gently held the third prince's hand and stood behind the great prince. To the imperial soldiers, officials, and Overwatch Council subordinates around him, he quietly said, "We are the emperor's officials. We have received the emperor's posthumous edict to stop those rebellious plots. Regardless of whether we succeed or fail, we will not retreat a single step." The great prince's expression was solemn. He continued Fan Xian's words and said, "There are 3 coffins here. Chengping, and Ji, and I will each have one. If the royal palace is broken into, the 3 of us will die here. This can be considered filial piety to father and loyalty to the Qing kingdom." He glanced at everyone and then slowly said, "Defend the palace to the death." Does everyone have confidence? Even the cliched method of carrying coffins to battle had been brought out by Fan Xian. How could the soldiers not feel their blood boil? In unison they cried out, "Yes." Fan Xian held Li Chengping's hand and said in an even voice, "Are you afraid?" The third prince thought for a bit and shook his head forcefully. "No. Father's son will not be afraid." "All right." Fan Xian glanced at him with a slight smile and didn't say anything more. He only thought that if the change did not happen and the royal palace was actually broken, he could only take the third prince and flee to the ends of the world. He could only hope that this kid wouldn't scold him when the time came. In the distance, the rebel soldiers began to gather again. The morale that had been suppressed by Fan Xian's evil plans seemed to have successfully turned into resentment toward the royal palace. Most of the Qing kingdom's troops had been on the battlefield for a long time. Their ability to mobilize soldiers was not inferior to anyone else's. The gazes of the rebel soldiers toward the royal palace began to fill with naked murderous intent. The sea of fire appeared terrifying, but in reality, it did not cause much damage to the rebel soldiers. Fan Xian looked at the scene in front of him and couldn't help his heart tremble slightly. He thought to himself that if he had calculated wrong, the following steps would probably kill many people on his side. He knew that he was completely unfamiliar with military affairs, so from beginning to end, he had not made any suggestions about the great prince's arrangement of troops. Instead, he calmly acted as a spectator and helper. At this moment, he was going to make an unusually daring suggestion. "How many imperial soldiers do we have left?" 2,700. "Basically, we haven't lost much." Fan Xian tilted his head and listened as the sounds of fighting in Taiping Square grew quieter. He furrowed his brows slightly and said, "Do you think we can hold it?" The great prince's sword-like brows were smeared with a layer of murderous intent. Straightforwardly, he said, "Even if father personally led troops, we wouldn't be able to hold it." A glimmer of self-mockery suddenly flashed through the corners of his lips. The disparity between us and the enemy is too great. If the Western Expedition Army had not been disbanded by father, if I led... No, even if I only led 1/3 of the Western Expedition Army, I would still dare to fight a decisive battle against the rebel soldiers below. The great prince took a deep breath. However, don't worry. Even if we lose, we won't lose so badly. The generals and soldiers under my command have all eaten Hu people's meat and drank Hu people's blood on the grasslands. The Qin family, it has been 20 years since the old man personally led troops. The soldiers of the Jingdou garrison are extremely lazy. The only one is the Dingzhou army. Fan Xian cut him off and said, in that round of attack and defense just now, I noticed a problem. What problem? Fan Xian moved closer to the great prince's ear and quietly said a few words. What are you thinking about? A cold light flashed through the great prince's eyes. I'm thinking about gambling. Fan Xian lowered his head and faintly said, we no longer have any trump cards in our hands. If we continue like this, we will eventually die. The great prince furrowed his brows and said, war is not child's play. What you're saying is too absurd. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. It is indeed absurd. However, I truly can't think of any opportunity to turn the tables. He turned his head and glanced at the 3 coffins glowing with black light. His gaze gradually became determined. He still had a trump card, but he had not seen everyone's trump card clearly. No matter what, he would not use it. The great prince was silent for a moment and then suddenly said, how do you want to gamble? Dig up the rocks at the palace gates. Fan Xian raised his face and looked through the slightly warm air of the square at the commander of the Dingzhou army, Yi Zhong, who was quietly saying something to the second prince. His gaze narrowed slightly. We should be prepared to charge out at any moment and give ourselves a chance. He then smiled warmly and said, give the world a surprise. Coincidentally, Yi Zhong, who was in the middle of a secret discussion with the second prince, seemed to feel the gaze from the palace walls. He raised his head and glanced back with unusual calmness and coldness. Ahem, when the great prince said this is war, I almost couldn't resist writing that all is fair in war. Everyone should know that I am the worst at writing these things. When I first conceived of Qing Yu's year, I made a great wish that I would try to learn and improve my abilities in this area. I am still not very good, but please see my progress and hard work. P.S. I don't know who wrote the KFC's Qing Yu's year review in the book review section. I just thought it was very funny. I don't know if that book friend knows me in real life, but most of his spoilers are definitely wrong. I was mad and changed the wrong words 3 times. It is now 6:08. To the friends who subscribed earlier, I apologize. Recently, there have been too many wrong words. No matter how mad I am, this is the 4th time I've changed the wrong words. I've actually changed them before, but there are still so many. This is 6:09. Sorry. Chapter 568. There was a faint smoke all around, a thick stench of blood, and a faint, terrifying smell of something burnt. The entire capital was in chaos. Other than the left and right of the royal palace, no one knew where else there was killing and strangling. The faint sounds of killing did not stop for a moment. The second prince furrowed his brows and stared in a daze at the blurry scene on the palace walls. Lowering his voice, he said, they won't be able to hold it. It's just a matter of how long they can last. All of the messengers my aunt arranged around Jingdou have been killed. It is impossible for reinforcements to come. Given Fan Xian's personality, he knows it's a dead end. Why would he fight so bravely? If it were any other time, he would have run a long time ago. Yi Zhong's armor was heavy and old and suffused with a dim light. This important figure in the Qing military glanced at his son-in-law. His eyes flashed slightly. Slowly, he said, there are so many people in the palace. How can he run? Everyone admitted that if Fan Xian led the Overwatch Council people and ran as soon as he saw the situation was not right, it would be difficult to dig him out in Jingdou, where hundreds of thousands of people lived, even if the eldest princess had many soldiers under her command. Everyone acknowledged Fan Xian's tyrannical strength and ability to escape. Yi Zhong was silent for a moment and then said, since Fan Xian isn't running, then he must have something to rely on. The second prince's expression calmed. This noble had listened to his aunt's suggestion and temporarily suppressed his ambitions to stand behind the crown prince, waving flags and shouting war cries. However, the string in his heart had long been plucked countless times. The The situation was not set in stone. He would not do anything too crazy. Particularly compared to the Crown Prince, he was more afraid of Fan Xian's existence. Fan Xian's attack on the second prince was not only a blow to his strength, but also a great blow to his spirit. The second prince took a deep breath and said, Fan Xian will always pull out his trump card at unexpected times. I have never underestimated him. Yi Zhong suddenly coldly cut him off. However, we can no longer preserve our strength. The great prince is leading thousands of imperial soldiers to defend the royal palace to the death. He also has the Overwatch Council's secret support. His strength is much more tyrannical than we originally thought. As for Taiping District, if we don't go all out to attack, I'm afraid there will be variables if we drag on. The second prince slowly lowered his head and thought about something in his heart. This time, the Qin and Yi families had formed a rebel army to surround the palace. Nominally, they both supported the crown prince's succession. Everyone knew, at least for now, that the Dingzhou Yi family belonged to the second prince. Thus, in the numerous attacks since the morning, the Yi family had not used their full strength. In the direction of Taiping Square, they were particularly careful because they were worried that they would lose too much of their strength. It was precisely because of this that the rebel army's attacks were not continuous. And all of this was something that the second prince had tacitly agreed to. Yi Zhong glanced at his son-in-law and said in a deep voice, I trust that Fan Xian has already seen this. I think he will immediately use this to drive a wedge between you and the crown prince. At this juncture, please put aside your past thoughts and first help the crown prince enter the palace. The second prince took a deep breath. A warm smile rose to his face as he nodded. Father-in-law is right. We cannot give Fan Xian any opportunity to use. If the crown prince and I continue to be suspicious of each other, it will only make the three brothers in the palace happy. He turned his head to glance at Yi Zhong and solemnly said, Have the crown prince and old Qin master attack without worry. I'll go to the central camp and ask for the crown prince's instructions. Yi Zhong furrowed his brows slightly. He knew that the second prince was going to use him as a hostage and use his safety to ensure the unity and will of the tens of thousands of rebel soldiers. He was not going to give Fan Xian any opportunity to use them. It's too dangerous. The commander of the Dingzhou army slowly closed his eyes. As the deputy general, I should go to the central camp to give orders. I'll just take a few trusted soldiers there. The Dingzhou army will be handed over to your highness to deal with. As for all matters regarding the attack on the city, the central camp will send out military orders. There won't be a situation where it is difficult to deliver military orders. The second prince paused. A moment later he was moved and said with concern, Father-in-law, be careful. Just as the second prince and Yi Zhong expected, seeing that the Dingzhou army was preserving their strength, Fan Xian would not let go of this opportunity to sow discord. Standing on the top of the city walls and gazing at the rebel army central camp, he once again began to call out to the crown prince. At this moment, the attack below the city walls was particularly urgent. The sound of drums was like thunder. Cries for killing rose from all directions. There were rebel soldiers climbing up ladders and beginning to brave arrows and rolling stones as they climbed toward the top of the city walls. It was at such a tense moment and in such a noisy and dangerous environment that Fan Xian's every word was branded into the ears of all of the rebel soldiers and Qin family generals. He only called out one thing toward the bottom of the palace walls. Old thief Qin, so many of your people have died. Does it not hurt? There was not a single word that mentioned the Yi family or the Dingzhou army. However, bodies were scattered across the square. The charred remains of the terrifying rebel soldiers still gave off a nauseating smell. As long as one was not blind, one would notice that the people who had died in these waves of attacks were mostly Qin family soldiers and two subordinates of the Jingdou garrison. Dingzhou had not suffered many losses. After these words were said, the leaders of the rebel army's central camp were all surprised. The crown prince smiled slightly and said to the generals beside him, Only an idiot would believe such childish sowing discord. Even a blind person could hear Fan Xian's intentions in such an open provocation. Only an idiot would foolishly fall for his trap and begin to suspect each other's intentions. Although the crown prince and second prince had once fought to the death in court, after experiencing the Dong Mountain incident and under the eldest princess' gentle and powerful suppression, they had no choice but to work closely together. The two Li princes were not idiots. They knew that they had to maintain a semblance of unity and cooperation. However, no matter how simple a plan was, when it was turned into direct words and landed in everyone's ears, it would have some effect on people's emotions, particularly the generals of the Qin family. Although they knew what Fan Xian wanted to achieve, they still couldn't help but feel a glimmer of anger. Since the beginning of the attack, it had always been the Qin family fighting the main force. The Dingzhou army had basically stood to the side and watched coldly. How could the Qin generals feel comfortable? After taking the flag and returning, Gong Dian, who had been standing 2 riders away from the crown prince, began to have an unnatural expression. It was as if he felt a glimmer of shame. Everyone had seen the Dingzhou army's behavior and knew that Yi Zhong and the second prince were certainly planning something in their hearts. Although it would not have much of an impact on the major event, the Qin family would certainly be furious. The crown prince glanced warmly at Gong Dian and said, Fan Xian knows that he has already entered a dead end, which is why he would do such senseless actions. As the saying goes, one should not be surprised by strange things. There are only so many people in the palace. I will use the army to suppress them. As long as we do not fall into chaos ourselves, the major event will eventually succeed. I hope everyone will work hard. Yes, Your Highness. The generals by his side all bowed. They knew that what the crown prince said was the correct path. Using the proper path to win through unusual means. If the correct path was magnanimous and powerful, why care about unusual means? With just a slight mention, the crown prince crushed Fan Xian's words and tossed them away. The generals began to get busy again. The crown prince and the old Qin master said something in a low voice. At the same time, they turned their gaze toward the top of the palace walls. At this moment, a soldier holding a flag arrived on a fast horse. Under everyone's slightly strange gaze, he reported in a loud voice, Deputy Commander Yi Zhong is here to ask for the crown prince's order. The crown prince was slightly startled, but his eyes lit up. To the side, the old Qin master suddenly opened his eyes. A cold light shone out but immediately calmed down. The situation was already set. The old Qin master couldn't help but begin to think about his only son, Qin Heng. He wondered what kind of blow he had suffered at Zhangyang Gate and why he had not returned to his troops yet. Although Yi Zhong's arrival was sudden, the old Qin master's heart only jumped slightly before he let it go. The old master guessed why Yi Zhong had come, but he was not worried that Yi Zhong would steal any of the Qin family's achievements. The Qin family's contribution in helping the crown prince to the throne was something no one could deny. As long as the crown prince ascended to the throne and became emperor, the Qin family could at least enjoy decades of peace after the old master died. The crown prince's glimmer of surprise and joy was because he had other thoughts. He knew that Yi Zhong had come because he didn't want Fan Xian's words to affect today's grand plan. However, this respect for him and the importance he placed on the overall situation made the crown prince see a glimmer of light. Fan Xian had placed the Empress Dowager and the Empress Dowager's medallions on the top of the palace walls. The crown prince and the old Qin master had had a fierce conflict. Although the crown prince had forcefully suppressed the thoughts of the Qin family's generals, he had other thoughts in his heart, thoughts that Fan Xian wanted him to have. A few days ago, the crown prince and the Empress Dowager had discussed deeply a number of times. They had never made up their minds to have the Qin family lead troops into the capital. They were afraid that the military would dominate in the future. Looking at the situation, the crown prince knew that, in the end, he was not his father. His influence on the military was still too small. He had to find some way to balance things out. Yi Zhong's sudden arrival made the crown prince find a glimmer of a possibility. Yi Zhong was the second prince's father-in-law. Logically speaking, he should be the person the crown prince was most wary of. However, the crown prince did not think that the alliance in this world would last forever. Everything was related to profit and had nothing to do with feelings and family. He was the true crown prince and was about to ascend to the throne. The Yi family's support of him was much more beneficial than supporting the second prince. Of course, he did not dare hope that the Yi family would suddenly turn to him. These things were problems to be considered a long time later. However, he had discovered this possibility. Li Chengqian felt a slight bitterness in his heart. The group of people below the palace walls were all traitors and immoral. What wouldn't they do? Yi Zhong entered the ranks and bowed solemnly to the crown prince. He reported the battle situation in Taiping Square. His trusted soldiers were far away outside the camp. Although the Qin family would not guard against him, they would not allow him to bring his trusted soldiers in. The old Qin master narrowed his eyes and nodded slightly toward Yi Zhong in greeting. Yi Zhong's expression was slightly dark. He was extremely calm. The siege continued. Arrows flew past in all directions. The sound of killing did not stop. There were already clear casualties among the imperial army. However, the royal palace was tall. The palace gates were filled with mountain rocks and sand, so they could still hold. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes as he watched the deaths happen in front of him. He didn't know what he was feeling. At this time, the great prince had already tidied up his light armor and removed the long sword at his waist. He took the long knife he had used to dominate the battlefield from his trusted soldier's hands and silently walked past behind him. Fan Xian suddenly stretched out his hand and grabbed his shoulder. In a low voice he said, "It's better if I go. I admit that you are very powerful, but leading soldiers to charge is not an assassination by one person." The great prince furrowed his brows and said, "It's better if I do this kind of thing. Watch the top of the palace walls. My mother's life is in your hands." Fan Xian was silent. He knew he would not be able to persuade this brother of his, who was about to go into battle. The great prince looked at him and suddenly said, "I wonder if I've gone crazy. To think that I'm going to take these hundreds of people to charge into the camp without knowing anything." He laughed bitterly and spat on the ground. "After I die, if you can escape, remember to burn some paper money for me every year." Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He knew that the custom of the Li family was to burn paper money. Hearing these words, he couldn't help but pat the great prince's shoulder. A moment later, he didn't say anything. He only squeezed out, "Big brother, be careful." Hearing the word big brother, the great prince laughed brightly and said, "To suddenly have you admit that I am your big brother at the moment of death is not bad." The great prince knew that Fan Xian didn't even want to acknowledge his father, yet he was willing to acknowledge him as his big brother. There were true emotions within. Fan Xian turned his head and watched the great prince and the imperial army members who were ready and waiting to go into the distance. He watched as they gently stroked the remaining 200 or so war horses in the royal palace. His gaze gradually grew gentle. He knew that if he lost this gamble, he might have a chance to turn things around. However, these people, as well as most of the people in the palace, would pay with their lives for his gamble. "If you all die, I will use a few years to kill everyone in the Li family to avenge you," Fan Xian said to himself in his heart. Fan Xian thought to himself. His gaze slowly swept past the top of the palace walls and the bottom of the palace walls. It swept past the imperial soldiers who were bravely resisting the rebel army. He looked at the Overwatch Council's trusted aides who held fast to the crossbows and were responsible for various communications. He looked at the scholars Hu and Shu, who stood with pale faces in front of the palace walls. Shu Wu's white beard floated in the wind and was disheveled. Fan Xian's heart dimmed slightly. He didn't know if this was the last time he would see these people's lively faces. He lowered his head and said a few words to the third prince, Li Changping. With a clap of his hands, he flipped up and stood on the 3 coffins on the palace walls. The autumn sun was nearing noon, but it suddenly burrowed into the dark clouds that had drifted over. The 3 coffins on the palace walls were painted completely black. Fan Xian was also completely black. He stood calmly on them, facing the slightly cold wind and looking at all of this vexing scene. Everyone on the palace walls saw this scene. The blood-soaked soldiers didn't have the leisure to watch. However, the people in the rebel army camp couldn't help but feel a chill in their hearts when they saw the black-clothed man standing against the wind on the palace walls. From the start of the battle until now, Fan Xian's little tricks had not had much effect. After Yi Zhong met with the crown prince, there were finally some small changes in the rebel army camp. The entire rebel army camp began to slowly and methodically change formations. The Dingzhou army had to replace the old Qin family and take on a portion of the responsibility of the traitors. This was the scene Fan Xian wanted to see. He watched all of this and found that although the Qing army was well trained, the Yi and Qin families rarely cooperated. When they changed formations, a few gaps finally appeared on the battle lines. The Dingzhou army was still far from moving into position. The Qin family still occupied the center. It was only the spiderweb-like alleys on the upper left that revealed their openings. Fan Xian did not have much military training, but he knew that he could not use those gaps. He could only silently pray in his heart that the good luck that had accompanied him for 20 years would shine brightly at this moment. It was as if heaven had its own will in the dark, and the will of heaven had heard the prayer in Fan Xian's heart. Just as the rebel army's formation change was slightly chaotic, The urgent sound of horse hooves filled with murderous intent finally came from the long street near the gap. Fan Xian's spirit rose. Focusing his gaze became very cold. It was not reinforcements. It was Qin Heng. After experiencing the cruel attack at Zhangyang Gate, Qin Heng, who had personally experienced the Nanzhao War and was a general behind a family of generals, finally relied on his powerful 5,000 riders to break through the combined attack of the Overwatch Council and Imperial Army riders. After a delay of 2 hours, he finally arrived at the royal palace. In an instant, it could be seen that Qin Heng's subordinates had already charged to the end of the street. It could be seen that the riders were covered in blood and wounds. Of the 5,000 riders, only 3,000 remained. One could imagine how tragic the attack at Zhangyang Gate had been. The tip of Fan Xian's heart ached like it had been pierced by a needle. He knew that his most loyal Overwatch Council subordinates had probably suffered heavy losses at Zhangyang Gate. No one knew how many had died or been injured. As for the group of Imperial Army the Great Prince had sent out, presumably, they had been completely wiped out. A bitter taste of blood rolled between his lips and tongue. After 2 coughs, Fan Xian stared with blood-red eyes. He knew that while the tyrannical ephedra pill had forcefully raised his realm, it had also deeply injured his heart meridians. He only stared at the opening and watched as the group of riders led by Qin Heng appeared in front of everyone's eyes through smoke and blood. "Do it!" He covered his bleeding lips and spoke indistinctly. Although the order was unclear and his voice was very low, the member of the Qinian unit, who had been waiting by his side the entire time, did not hesitate at all. He raised his right arm and pulled with all his might. The signal arrow in his hand shot into the sky. In the dark and gloomy sky, it exploded into a beautiful firework. From last night until now, it was the second firework in Jingdo. The moment the signal went out, waves of strange sounds rang out from the private residences behind the square in front of the royal palace, attracting the attention of many people. In the middle of the 3 streets to the front and left, a rush of horse hooves suddenly rang out. Qin Heng's riders had already arrived. So where did the sound of horse hooves come from? Who were these determined and hurried riders? Who were even faster and more murderous than the Qin family's blood-soaked riders? Like 2 gusts of wind destined to meet, the riders charging toward the square along the 2 roads at the same time finally met at the intersection of the 2 streets and collided violently and suddenly. There were not many riders hidden in the dark, but they carried with them an aura different from that of normal Qing soldiers. Not only was there a murderous aura, but there was also a sense of the cold underworld. Their entire bodies were covered in black armor. It was as if not even a glimmer of light would be reflected. It was as black as ink. The Overwatch Council's Black Knights were rumored to be the riders with the greatest killing power in the Qing kingdom. However, not many people had seen their method of battle or their great strength. Within the Qing military, many people expressed a disdainful attitude toward the Black Knights. They thought that Chen Pingping, that old dog, could not train iron-blooded riders. Today, this mysterious Black Knight troop finally collided with the elite riders of the Qing kingdom. Furthermore, they used blood-like facts to tell everyone that in terms of the quality of riders, the Black Knights would always be the most valiant. The sudden appearance of the Black Knights was outside of everyone's expectations. A glimmer of excitement flashed through the old Qin master's eyes. At the first moment, he discovered the problem. A cold light flashed through his eyes again. No one knew how Fan Xian had hidden this group of riders among the private residences behind the rebel soldiers. No one knew how this all-black group of dark riders managed to do it without making a single sound. Qin Heng led the riders and sped past the intersection of the street. He then saw the black, heart-palpitating figures of riders charging toward him from the other side of the road. There were too few people in this group of Black Knights, only 200. If the Great Prince was still on top of the palace walls, he would certainly guess that this was the group Fan Xian had sent out of the palace last night. It was the group led by the deputy commander of the Black Knights, Jing Gu, who had disappeared without a trace for a long time. Although there were only 200 people, this group of Shadow Knights seemed to have 2,000 people. No, it was more like one person was fighting. The leader wore a silver mask and gripped his spear tightly. He was like the sharpest point on the edge of a blade, charging at the forefront at an incredible speed. The 200 riders behind him were like a sharp blade and solid blade behind a dagger. They maintained a tight formation and used excellent riding skills to support themselves. They followed closely behind the silver-masked Jinggu and stabbed viciously into the front of Qin Heng's 2,000 riders. Only the Black Knights would have such determination and daring to fight with 200 against 2,000. Decades ago, the predecessors of the Black Knights had once, under Chen Pingping's lead, launched a surprise attack 3,000 li north and deep into the Wei Kingdom. They had captured the leader of the Wei Kingdom's Tiki, Xiao, alive and then escaped unscathed. The Black Knights could launch a surprise attack 3,000 li, much less a mere 3,000 zhong. Only those who remembered history well would understand that the Black Knights were the most powerful riders in the world. Only those who remembered history would understand why the Qing Emperor always forcefully ordered Chen Pingping to limit the number of Black Knights to 1,000. Chapter 569. Because it was difficult to write, it was a bit slow. The contents of this chapter satisfied my long-suppressed desire for a story. I wrote what I wanted to write. I am very pleased. At the T-junction, the two groups of riders, who were going to use their collisions to decide life and death, swept out of their respective alleys like two gusts of wind. In the empty space in the northwest corner of the square in front of the palace, they collided together viciously. In the instant before the collision, the black cavalrymen who were charging forward at high speed were fully armored. They held the reins in one hand and did not hold any swords or spears in the other. Instead, they held their crossbows horizontally. Before anyone could react, they pulled the trigger. The Qing Kingdom's riders were skilled in the art of mounted archery. In such a head-on charge, they were usually used to facing each other with knives and spears. Basically, no one would use crossbows to charge. The crossbows themselves were heavy. Furthermore, in such a short distance, if one's movement was slightly slower, the two sides would probably collide before the crossbow could be fired. However, the Black Knights were different. From the first day they entered the Overwatch Council, they had developed this habit. Holding the crossbow with one hand, they remained steady. More accurately speaking, the nearly 1,000 Black Knights of the Overwatch Council were, in reality, a powerful mass assassination and surprise attack weapon. The sound of the arrows breaking through the air rang out. In such a short distance, hundreds of sharp and poisoned crossbow bolts all shot out. They did not give the riders suddenly coming from Zhangyang Gate any chance to resist. After countless muffled sounds, countless riders in the front of the riders suddenly coming from Zhangyang Gate were hit by the crossbow bolts and fell tragically from their horses. However, some persevered on their horses and pulled out knives. With a wild roar, they hacked at the riders coming closer and closer. The Black Knights abandoned their crossbows and pulled out knives from under their saddles. With a backhand slash, the knife turned into a snowy light and directly chopped off the rider's head. 200 Shadow Knights performed the same action at the same time. They abandoned their crossbows cleanly, drew their swords with the force of mountains and rivers, and slashed at the enemy's head with a soul-stirring slash. 200 men neatly performed such a difficult attack, and it looked extremely beautiful on the battlefield. On one side was the group of rebel riders who had bitterly attacked Zhangyang Gate. After being strangled for a long time by over 1,000 Overwatch Council subordinates and Imperial soldiers, they had finally managed to clear a path and arrived with great difficulty in front of the royal palace. On one side was the mysterious Black Knights who had endured silently for a long time and built up their strength. Once the commissioner gave the order, they would deliver the Overwatch Council's most powerful attack. The momentum, spirit, and physical strength of both sides were originally not that far apart due to the current situation. However, the gap was suddenly pulled to a point where it was impossible to bear on the battlefield. The 200 Black Knights were like a heated knife. They charged into the Qin family cavalry with incomparable sharpness. They easily and happily cut open a large hole in the formation of the cavalry that had reached into the square of the royal palace. Following the countless spurts of blood and corpses falling from their horses, the Black Knights successfully broke through the Qin family cavalry. They separated Qin Heng and the 300 riders from the main group, making them an isolated army. The Black Knights' riding skills were superb. Amidst their speed, they successfully changed their formation. The entire group suddenly scattered. The riders charging at the very front pulled on the reins to the right. Relying on their extraordinary speed and powerful momentum, they blocked off the main group of riders behind them. The remaining 100 or so Black Knights stabbed to the left like a pack of wolves. They quickly picked their targets and pressed close to where Qin Heng was in the vanguard camp. They stuck closely together and used the knives in their hands to bite and kill. In an instant, the vanguard camp Qin Heng was in had suffered heavy casualties. The hearts of the main group of riders in the back had been shaken by this thunderous attack. For a moment, They were unable to charge forward to help. Although there were many rebel soldiers in the square, there was still a distance between them. Particularly as the rebel army was changing their formation, the situation was slightly chaotic. Looking at the Black Knight's lightning-like speed, no one knew whether or not they would be able to completely kill these hundreds of riders when the main group came to surround them. The hoofs of the horses were like thunder. The horses under the Black Knights silently advanced with all their might. The horses under the Qin family riders neighed and ran wildly, just like the mood of their masters on their backs. The speed of the Black Knight's pursuit was too fast. In a moment, they had chased Qin Heng's vanguard camp into the square for some distance and separated from the main group behind them. This scene was truly frightening to watch. There were rebel soldiers all around them. The old Qin master and Yi Zhong had long reacted. They ordered the rebel soldiers to quickly close up the gap in the northwest. They had to make contact with Qin Heng before the Black Knights succeeded. If they allowed the tens of thousands of rebel soldiers to successfully surround them, no matter how tyrannical the Black Knights were, only death awaited them. Even if the Black Knights successfully followed Fan Xian's orders to kill Qin Heng, they would probably still die in the end. However, the Black Knights, led by Jing Gu, did not seem to consider this at all. Under the gazes of tens of thousands of people, surrounded by countless rebel soldiers, and in the spacious square in front of the palace, they fearlessly chased after the tail of Qin Heng's vanguard camp bravely and somewhat arrogantly. Dust gradually rose. Under the eyes of tens of thousands of rebel soldiers, 100 or so Black Knights chased after hundreds of elite Qin family riders. This kind of decisive stance, this kind of arrogant and disdainful aura, and this heart-shaking scene would remain in people's memories for a long time. In a dragon of dust, hundreds of riders risked their lives in pursuit from the northwest corner of the square all the way to the center of the square. Qin Heng was not a weakling. Otherwise, he could not have become the second youngest commander of the Jingdo garrison after Yi Zhong at the age of 30. He also could not have become the deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs at such a young age. As for the situation on the battlefield, this second-generation leading figure of the Qin family had, without question, his own wisdom and judgment. He was good at leading troops and reacted quickly. When the shadows of the Black Knights appeared beside his eyes, he immediately made a decision and carried out the first head-on charge. As long as they could stand against the first wave of attacks, the main force in the rear would continue to come. The opponent's mere 200 riders would not be able to affect them at all. However, the battle in Jingdo was truly too different from the killing on the battlefield. The street fighting under Zhangyang Gate was also very different from the street fighting described in military books. Qin Heng had never thought that the Overwatch Council, a department that relied on intelligence and assassination, would be able to explode with such power in street fighting and cause the Qin family riders to suffer heavy losses. At the same time, they had used up too much of their morale, mental, and physical strength. The most important thing was that Qin Heng had never thought that a mere 200 Black Knights would actually have such a powerful aura, a fast-charging force, and an extremely cold killing method. He had never thought that the 500 riders in the vanguard would not even be able to stand against the opponent's first wave of attacks and be ruthlessly cut in half by the opponent. Qin Heng's heart was cold, but his reaction was strangely fast. He whipped his horse and did not stay where he was to fight against the Black Knights. Instead, he increased his speed and led his riders toward the center of the square. All around them were rebel soldiers. As long as they entered the encirclement, the Black Knights could only wait for death. What he had to do was be fast as possible. It should be said that Qin Heng's reaction was strangely fast. The training of the Qin family riders was also very effective. Although the Black Knights were like a pack of wolves charging and biting, the vanguard still successfully escaped from the Ding family road into the square. However, the Black Knights were faster and more ruthless. They were not left behind at all. Instead, they faintly formed an encirclement. The silver-masked leader of the Black Knights charged over from the side. He was only 3 horse lengths away from Qin Heng. A cold light shot out of Qin Heng's eyes inside his helmet. The bravery of the Black Knights was beyond his expectations. The other party actually dared to chase him deep into the rebel army's encirclement. It looked like they were prepared to stab him to death, even if it meant risking their lives. However, he knew that the Black Knight's ambush had already failed. He knew that his old father would not just watch him die. At the same time, the rebel army's camp change was halfway through. They discovered that Qin Heng was in deep danger. Naturally, they sent out 2 large groups to come to his aid. At the same time, they intended to completely wipe out the Black Knights who seemed to have suddenly descended from the heavens. However, these two groups were still some distance away from the Dust Dragon. Most of them were infantry. If they could keep up with the Black Knight's ambush and Qin Heng's extraordinary speed of running for his life. At this moment, a mighty order rang out from the rebel army's camp. Release! There was the Lord God tablet on the palace walls. The rain of arrows did not have the glory of landing. The soul-stirring scene in the square could not stop the old Qin master's determination. Following this order, countless arrows flew toward the Dust Dragon. The sound of the arrows piercing through the air rang out in a continuous stream. It enveloped all of the riders who were fighting with their lives on the line. They did not care that the Black Knights were chasing their own riders. Qin Heng had long guessed that his father would never have any hesitation on the battlefield. He also knew that this rain of arrows would arrive. His face was ashen, and the high speed caused his lips to turn white. Before the rain of arrows arrived, he had already flipped his body and shot towards the back of his mount. The merciless arrows pierced into everyone's bodies, breaking through the bodies of the charging cavalrymen. The spinning arrows tore through the cavalrymen's light armor, pierced through the humans' brittle skin, and pierced into their internal organs and bones. In an instant, the riders on both sides charging at high speed were attacked by the rain of arrows at the same time. One by one, they fell off their horses and fell to the ground. Their bones and flesh separated from their bodies with a series of muffled thuds. Regardless of whether it was the Qin family's riders or the Overwatch Council's Black Knights, they all met the same fate, a wretched fate. Although the Black Knight's armor was specially made by the Palace Treasury's third workshop and was lighter and better than the Qing army's elite armor, they still suffered heavy losses under this round of arrow rain. The Qin family's own riders also met with a disaster. The Crown Prince abruptly turned his head and looked at the old Qin master in disbelief. It was as if he had not thought he would give such a terrifying order. Was he not worried about Qin Heng's life or death? Furthermore, these 200 Black Knights could not cause any major damage. To use this rain of arrows to kill without distinguishing between friend and foe, was he not worried that it would destabilize the army's morale? The old Qin master narrowed his eyes. A cold light shone through the two small cracks. Of all the people present, only he knew what the goal of the Black Knights was. Only he knew that if he allowed these 200 Black Knights to continue their pursuit, the vanguard camp led by Qin Heng would not be able to escape before the rebel army's reinforcements arrived. He knew the power of the Black Knights. He thought that Fan Xian's arrangement at Zhangyang Gate and the Black Knights lying in ambush here were all because of the words that had made him extremely angry earlier on the palace walls. I want the Qin family line to end without descendants. The old Qin master was a ruthless person. Since Fan Xian wanted to end his line, he would rather do it himself than humbly watch as the people Fan Xian had arranged killed his son. Furthermore, how could the son of the Qin family die so easily? Qin Heng did not die. His mount was covered in arrows. After two mournful cries, it fell heavily toward the ground. Because he had been prepared, although he had been hit heavily by the forward roll of the horse after it fell to the ground and the armor on his body even created countless weak sparks because of the friction with the ground, he had already dissipated most of the force. Furthermore, with the cover of his mount, he was not hit by the arrows. There was only one wave of arrows, and then it stopped. Most of the pursuing cavalrymen had already fallen into pools of blood. Although the Shadow Cavalry had more survivors, they had also lost their mounts and suffered heavy or light injuries. However, they did not panic. Instead, they continued to raise their sabers and charged at the Qin family cavalrymen who had fallen to the ground. At this time, Qin Heng had already stood up. The rebel army reinforcements around him also quickly approached. Jinggu, the silver-masked deputy commander of the Black Knights, had become the tip of the Black Knight's spear from the beginning of the battle. With the most decisive stance and the fastest speed, he stared fixedly at Qin Heng, not letting him out of his line of sight. As the rain of arrows came, Jinggu and his horse also received a terrible blow. An arrow very cleverly passed through the armor on his body and slanted into his left shoulder. A streak of blood quickly seeped out. The front legs of the horse under him also weakened and silently fell to the ground. His feet landed heavily on the saddle. In the instant that the rain of arrows stopped, he held the long black spear in his hand and leapt out like a wolf king, carrying with it a thirst for blood that had been hidden for many years. His power could not be stopped. The distance of 30 feet was covered in a flash. Qin Heng had just pulled his leg out from under his horse and stood up with great difficulty. It looked like his mental and physical strength had been exhausted to the extreme. With the sharp killing intent of the black spear pointed at him, it seemed that he could only wait helplessly for death. But no one would have thought that Qin Heng's body, which looked extremely tired, actually had energy again at this moment. With a fierce shout, he did not turn around, but had already pulled out his sword. His entire body quickly began to spin, and like a shadow, he very strangely brushed past the sharp black spear shadow. Jing Ji's spear stabbed out with all his might. He had not expected his opponent to have such an ingenious movement to counter the spear. His entire mind and spirit were focused on this spear. The tip of the spear missed and stabbed viciously into the stone floor of the square beside Qin Heng. With a crack, the stone floor was shattered into countless pieces. In that muffled sound, Qin Heng's body did not stop spinning. In a moment, he was close to Jing Ji's body. With a cold huff, his left elbow shot out, and the blade of the sword in his hand sliced toward Jing Ji's neck. One flash, one turn, and one slash. Such a clean and efficient three-hit combo was used in such a complicated battlefield situation. Qin Heng was indeed valiant. No wonder the old Qin master had so much confidence in him to let him face the silver-masked Jing Ji's sudden attack alone. At such a close distance, such a vicious slash would probably be difficult for even Fan Xian to block. Jing Gu was probably dead for sure. During this soul-stirring chase, the rebel army's attacks on the royal palace never stopped. The heavy carriages that were used to ram into the palace gates still did not know fatigue. They were not afraid of falling rocks or burning the ground. They continued to ram into the 3 palace gates one after another. A loud muffled sound reverberated throughout the royal palace from time to time. It sounded like a soul-shaking drum beat. In the last moment of the strange chase in the square, when Qin Heng's sword was only 3 inches from Jing Ji's neck, a shocking change occurred in the attack and defense of the palace doors. With a loud bang, the heavy palace door in the middle was smashed open. In this instant, all of the rebel soldiers could not believe their eyes. Immediately after, wild joy and excitement took over. The Black Knights had already been defeated, Jing Gu was about to die, and the palace doors had already been opened. The scales of victory had, without question, thrown away all barriers. They began to cowardly snuggle up behind the rebel army. Looking at this scene, the crown prince's spirit rose. He glanced at the old Qin master and Yi Zhong beside him and took a deep breath. Attack with full power. Fan Xian stood on top of the black coffin and gently used the tip of his foot to tap a rhythm no one could understand. He watched these fatal changes happen in a flash on the palace walls, but he still did not make a decision. He kicked open the coffin with one foot and took out the heavy sniper rifle inside. Because he was standing higher than everyone else, just as Chen Pingping had once taught him, he could see further than everyone else. He could see some details that no one else had noticed. He saw that the generals of the Dingzhou family were still in the rebel army camp in the west discussing something with the second prince. They gradually moved closer and naturally isolated the second prince's trusted aides on the outside. He saw that in the rebel army camp, Yi Zhong's expression was as calm as usual beside the crown prince, who showed a joyous expression for the first time. However, Gong Dian had lagged a step behind. During the process of the rebel army changing camps and the chaos brought by rescuing Qin Heng, the Dingzhou army gradually changed their formation. Although it was subtle, it was particularly piercing in Fan Xian's eyes, who was looking down from above. If a complicated situation was made up of countless pictures, then in Fan Xian's eyes, these pictures were undergoing changes that no one understood. However, he knew that his gamble would determine the final success or failure based on the changes in these pictures. He tied the Wei Emperor's sword tightly to his back and pulled on the hook the third bureau had prepared for him 2 years ago. Glancing in the direction of the city guarding crossbows, he narrowed his eyes slightly and said, "Get ready." Then, he tapped the coffin with the tip of his foot for the last time, thinking, "I still won't use you today." The change in the images suddenly occurred in the next moment. This change would decide the future of the Qing kingdom. It was destined to become something that young historians with a conscience in the future would discuss enthusiastically. The first scene to change was the silver-masked Jing Gu, who was about to face death, lowering his head the moment the tip of Qin Heng's sword reached his neck. Jing Gu lowered his head. In the time it took for a spark to fly off a piece of flint, lowering his head looked simple, but it was actually extremely difficult. However, he had done it so naturally and quickly. It was as if 500 years ago, Jingu already knew where Qin Heng's sword would come from and where it would go. He had already simulated it countless times and had long been prepared to meet the edge of this sword. It was this gentleness of lowering his head that allowed Qin Heng's murderous sword to cut across Jing Ji's silver mask and draw out a streak of silver sparks. However, it did not cut his neck. What was even more unexpected was that Jing Ji's spear, which seemed to have poured all of his spirit into it, pierced empty air and broke the stone floor on the ground. It seemed to have a life of its own and quickly bounced back. Following the empty space between his thumb and index finger, it bounced back with a bang. Jing Ji's hand gripped the tip of the spear tightly 3 inches below and abruptly stabbed upward. All of this happened too quickly. The silver mask on Jing Ji's face was still sparking when the tip of the spear in his hand had already pierced ruthlessly into Qin Heng's jaw. With a muffled crack, the sharp tip of the spear pierced straight through Qin Heng's jaw into his brain. Fresh blood sprayed out. Qin Heng's body froze and then went limp. He died just like that. Jingu gripped the shaft of the spear tightly. The tip of the spear held Qin Heng's body. With a crisp sound, Jing Ji's silver mask broke in half and slid to the ground, revealing his true face. It was the face that Fan Xian had always wanted to see. It was the face that had been hidden under the silver mask ever since he had been fished out of the Black Prison by Chen Pingping, and became a member of the Black Knights. The features of this face were delicate and pretty, but from the left ear to the bottom of the right ear, it had been viciously sliced open in the middle by some unknown sharp weapon. It was a very old injury, but it still appeared terrifying. One could imagine what kind of injury he had suffered in the past. The wound was large, revealing the bone, flesh, and white teeth inside. It appeared unusually terrifying. Although Qin Heng's earlier strike had been blocked by his silver mask, the sword intent still struck his face and shook open his old wound. Fresh blood gradually flowed out, making him appear even more savage. The entire square was completely silent as they looked at this scene in shock. They looked at the savage commander of the Black Knights using the tip of the spear in his hand to hold up the old Qin master's only son. Involuntarily, they thought of Fan Xian's curse of ending the Qin family line. Fresh blood dripped down from Qin Heng's throat and slid along the long sword to Jing Ji's hand. Jingu was silent. He was thinking back then, your brother had used this move to ruin my face. These years, my hatred toward the Qin family caused me to wear a silver mask and constantly ponder the Qin family's methods on the killing field. Today you still use this move. If you die at my hands, don't cry injustice. Jingu held up Qin Heng's body and looked toward where the old Qin master was in the rebel camp. In a stern voice he said, I am Jingu. Chapter 570. I saw a post in the book review section and was very angry and sad. I wrote a very long piece of gossip. After calmly thinking for a long time, I decided to delete it all because today is a joyous day. I will continue not to look at the book review section. Unfortunately, I may miss many good book reviews. After all, the leader also has to go to work. He can't keep an eye on it all the time. Everyone can also post the book reviews they value to the club. The club is in the relevant club on the right side of the page. It's called Qing Yunyan, Cat Fan, Old P, Yuan, and Bachelor. Those good managers will certainly value it very much. Thank you for your hard work. Add a sentence. After I finished writing yesterday afternoon, I found that I was sick again, so those who said I was pretending to be sick can continue. Then, I sincerely call for monthly votes to everyone. Those who scolded me for not writing enough and dragging on and still have the nerve to ask for votes can also continue. I wish everyone a happy life and a happy Olympics. I will continue to write this story seriously. Please read it happily. Qin Heng's body hung from Jing Ji's spear. Fresh blood dripped down. In this moment, his chest was filled with the joy of revenge and the smell of blood. He wanted to shout to his heart's content in this encirclement of tens of thousands of soldiers. He had finally avenged his family. After hiding in the darkness for so many years, he had finally avenged his family. Outside Jiaozhou, he had told Fan Xian of his past for the first time. Half a year later, Fan Xian had quietly promised to give him a chance for revenge. Jingu didn't know what power Sir Fan Jr. had to help him fulfill his wish, but his wish had finally become reality. Joy, boundless joy and murderous intent made Jingu laugh happily. The wretched wound had split open between his ears like a clown's mouth. Because of his laughter, it opened wider and wider. It looked particularly terrifying and miserable. Tears rolled down his face like rain. The people who saw this scene all felt a chill rise from the depths of their hearts. Riding on the horse, the old Qin master's heart felt like it was being torn apart. His vision darkened, but he valiantly sat straight on the horse. He did not let anyone notice that he was almost unable to endure the mental decline. The old Qin master's face was pale and his white hair fluttered in the wind. He looked at his only son, who had been stabbed by the monstrous Shadow Knight's spear, without saying a word. At this moment, the second scene in the scene that was quietly changing like an undercurrent in the imperial city also changed. It was as if a divine painter was splashing ink all over the mountains, sprinkling tens of thousands of vermilion dots. Suddenly, countless wildflowers bloomed in the mountains, turning from a desolate scene to a bountiful harvest. The main palace gate was smashed open by the rebel army's heavy chariots. The rebel army was shouting as they charged inside. However, a large blade was swung out from the palace gate, bringing with it a cold light and a streak of blood. Several heads fell to the ground. He waved his broadsword again. In a flash of cold light, the silver-armored first prince rode on his horse. With an indomitable aura, he leaped out of the palace gates like a god, his broadsword opening up a bloody path. Creak, creak, creak. The heads of the vanguard of the rebel army fell. The first prince gave a roar. Holding the long broadsword in his hand, he led the 200 imperial soldiers behind him in a sudden charge. Unexpectedly, the moment the palace gates were broken open, they charged out first. This was the first true attack of the people in the royal palace. The sound of horse hooves thundering rang out. Although only a small path had been cleared out of the mountain rocks and sand inside the palace gates, it did not stop the speed of the first prince's counterattack. The 200 imperial soldiers quickly rode out. Relying on their high-speed charge and excellent riding skills, they broke open a large gap in the vanguard of the rebel army in front of the palace gates like a knife cutting through tofu. Wherever the cold light passed, no one could stop it. Those who dared were turned into corpses and severed limbs on the ground. In just an instant, the imperial soldiers had charged out nearly 200 feet from the suddenly opened palace gates. Like a silver stream, they were unstoppable. At this time, the rebel army had already begun to charge toward the broken palace gates. They were densely packed like locusts filling the sky, making one shiver in fear. Although the 200 imperial soldiers were powerful, in front of such a powerful rebel army, they were only as thick as a silver thread. However, the first prince was not afraid. Since he trusted Fan Xian, he had already cast aside his own life and death. As he charged, he flipped his wrist. The broadsword drew an arc in the air and chopped straight down toward his right. With a crisp crack, the short spear in a rebel army officer's hand snapped in half. The broadsword chopped into the officer's shoulder. The first prince furrowed his brows and gave a muffled grunt. Gathering strength from his waist, he moved his arm. With a swish, the blade of the broadsword broke out of his body and immediately chopped the officer's body in half. Immediately after, the first prince bent his body and avoided a spiked stick flying toward his face. At this moment, he dragged the broadsword in his hand behind him and spun it around his waist. Using his powerful arm strength, he chopped down diagonally. The edge of the broadsword whistled through the air and domineeringly chopped off the head of the rebel soldier on his left. With a light slap, countless drops of blood sprayed onto the first prince's silver armor. The long broadsword in his hand was also stained with thick blood. The silver and red added together was just like the bright red cloak he usually liked to wear. Following the imperial soldier's desperate attack, it became a line of blood. It appeared exceptionally shocking and magnificent. His helmet pressed down on the first prince's sword-like brows. A wildfire burned in his eyes. Bravely and unstoppably, he led his subordinates and charged toward the rebel army's camp in the distance. Who knew how many obstructions and killings he would encounter along the way? Perhaps he would never be able to charge in front of Li Chengqian, but he still had to charge. He was the commander of the Qing Kingdom's Western Expedition Army, and the only person of the royal family who had experience on the battlefield. Even if he didn't understand Fan Xian's intentions, since he had accepted this mission, he had to see it through to the end. He was not a martial ace, but he was a fierce general in the army. The attack and defense battles in Jingdo could not bring out his ability to command in field battles. However, the first prince had never been afraid of charging and breaking through enemy lines. Horse fighting skills on the battlefield were completely different from battles between aces. What was important was momentum. The first prince's momentum had, without question, been raised to its peak by his determination to die. As a child of mixed blood between Dongyi and the Qing kingdom, from a certain point of view, he was not favored by the emperor. However, he had strong feelings for this land. An arrow shot out from the dark and was chopped aside by the tip of his broadsword. However, it caused his figure to pause. The countless spears of the rebel soldiers below his horse drew a few bloody wounds on his body. Fortunately, the horse was fast and did not fall into the encirclement. Instead, he killed his way through and continued charging toward the rebel army camp. There was still a long way to go, but the 200 imperial soldiers gave one the feeling that they would charge in front of the crown prince in the next moment. Fan Xian stood on the black coffin and watched everything below the palace walls nervously. When the great prince charged into his field of vision through the palace doors below the palace walls, he immediately gave an order. Open the way for His Highness. There were not many imperial soldiers and Overwatch Council subordinates left on the palace walls. Most of them were doing their best to hold out against the rebel soldiers climbing up the palace walls using ladders. Relying on the 4 hours of preparation in the early hours of the morning, not a single rebel soldier had climbed to the top of the palace walls. However, they had long received military orders. Although they were secretly afraid, they still carried out Fan Xian's orders without any delay. They left the area of the palace walls they were guarding and quickly moved toward the center. They fired out the few arrows in their hands without holding back at all. The arrows were concentrated like rain, all of them landing in front of the great prince's imperial army's path of attack. They all landed on the heads of the rebel soldiers and immediately caused great damage. It also reduced the resistance on the great prince's path of attack. However, the defenses in the other areas of the royal palace became weaker. Without the protection of arrows, the rebel soldiers on the ladders seemed to have taken stimulants. They climbed bravely and were about to reach the top of the palace walls. The imperial soldiers pulled their bowstrings with all their might. They could not feel the pain in their arms or the blood on their fingers from the vibrations of the bowstrings. They were under Duke Fan's orders to use the bows and arrows in their hands to open the way for the prince. What if the rebel soldiers attacked the royal palace? The prince was leading 200 brothers in an attack amidst the encirclement of the rebel soldiers. If their bows and arrows slowed for a moment and the prince was injured, what would happen? Terror, unease, heroism, and all kinds of emotions rolled through the hearts of the imperial soldiers on the palace walls. The rebel soldiers had already climbed up the ladders to the top of the palace walls. Although there were not many people on the palace walls, they were all good men of the Qin family's army. With great difficulty, they found their footing and began to expand their positions to open a path for the rebel soldiers behind them. At the palace gate below the palace walls, the 200 imperial soldiers had already charged out. The rebel soldiers could not stop them, so they charged in through the broken palace gate and fought with the remaining defensive forces in the palace. The royal palace was about to fall, and the great prince was still charging through the rebel soldiers below the palace walls. At this moment, there were two muffled hums. The two giant city-guarding crossbows, which had stopped for a while, finally began to fire again. This time, the fire was not aimed at the battered carriages charging through the gate or the 3-section cloud carriages being transported in. Instead, under Fan Xian's strong request, they all landed among the rebel soldiers, right in front of the great prince's path of attack. It was just like where the imperial soldiers' arrows were pointing. The giant crossbows landed and pierced through the bodies of countless rebel soldiers, sending up waves of bloody mist. They then stabbed heavily into the stone slabs. Some bounced up. The massive weight and powerful force of impact were enough to crush a few people to death. The sudden powerful rain of arrows and the terrifyingly powerful crossbow bolts greatly supported the great prince's attack. They opened up a bloody path right in the middle of the rebel army. The great prince led the imperial army. Like a silver line, they followed this bloody path and bravely attacked the rebel army's camp. The rebel soldiers clearly had the advantage in numbers. Seeing the great prince's magnificent and heroic figure on the horse, they felt their hearts tremble for no reason. The Qing army placed the most importance on military service. Everyone knew that for many years, it was this great prince who had led the army in battle against the Hu people on the western frontier. He had never tasted defeat and had performed a great service for the Qing kingdom. The great prince had also become a famous general in the army. The sense of pressure and force of impact created by a famous general leading an attack was not something a normal person could stand against. Fan Xian looked at the heroic scene and took a deep breath. The two slowly moving circulations in his body suddenly sped up. He gradually removed the layer of Tiani Dao Xunqi from the meridians in his body, and allowed the ruthless and tyrannical Xunqi to begin to circulate valiantly through his body. The blood veins in his eyes grew thicker and thicker. The effect of the medicine had reached its peak. He gripped the grappling hook in his hand tightly and waited for the sound of the last crossbow bolt. Jinggu, who had killed Qin Hang, had already been surrounded by the rebel soldiers who had arrived first. The old Qin master coldly and listlessly pulled back his gaze and turned it toward the chaos in front of him that was still far away. He knew that the great prince had already begun to lead the counterattack. He knew how wild and heroic the great prince's battle style was. If the other side still had 3,000 riders, perhaps the old Qin master would temporarily avoid the other side's attack. However, the rebel army's victory was already set. They had already broken through the palace gates on the city walls. At such a critical moment, the old Qin master would not retreat even one step. This was a natural intuition formed after decades on the battlefield. Looking at the great prince's blood-soaked heroic figure and thinking of the scene of his only son's tragic death earlier, the old Qin master suddenly felt that he had grown old. He was even about to smell the scent of death. The pain that had been hidden deep in his heart made him make a wrong decision after a moment of hesitation. The enemy's final crazy counterattack cannot be underestimated. The old Qin master coughed and said to his trusted family general, "Take the crown prince to the back of the camp." The crown prince glanced at the old Qin master. He originally did not want to retreat, but the crown prince did not know military affairs and was unwilling to interfere with old General Qin's troops at such a critical moment. He could only leave quietly. The old Qin master was an old general on the battlefield. When the great prince's final counterattack came, he chose to be as still as a mountain. It was naturally the best decision. However, personally seeing the tragedy of his only son's death made him more conservative. He had his family general lead the crown prince to temporarily avoid the great prince's counterattack. With this, there were only 8 Qin family generals left at his side. Perhaps, as a 9th-level ace, the old Qin master did not care about anything. But Fan Xian cared. The massive city-guarding crossbows had finally used up all of their arrows. The rain of arrows from the imperial army had also become sparse. The imperial army troops led by the great prince, after paying a heavy price, were still unable to break into the rebel army's camp. Perhaps miracles could happen on the battlefield, but to rely on 200 riders to carry out a successful counterattack was no longer a miracle. It was wishful thinking. The great prince had fought until now, bathed in blood. He had already killed a long bloody path. His valiant battle abilities on the battlefield had already scared countless rebel soldiers to death. At this moment, the royal palace was about to fall. The great prince was surrounded. The remaining Black Knights and Jinggu were surrounded. The situation was already set. Even the sound of the last city-guarding crossbow was very different from the previous dozen arrows. It flew out at an angle and gave off a sorrowful whimper. After the last arrow was shot, the 2 city-guarding crossbows fell silent. Everyone seemed to clearly hear the sorrowful sound of the arrow, and capture the trajectory of the arrow as it tore through the air. No one noticed that the trajectory of this arrow was completely different from the one that had opened up a path for the great prince. This arrow flew at an angle and swept over the heads of all the rebel soldiers. It did not cause any damage. Instead, it slowly used up its energy in the air. After flying a long distance, it landed heavily in front of the rebel army camp. Although the arrow had flown far, it did not pose any threat. In the end, it fell miserably to the ground like a piece of scrap metal. It did not hit a single rebel soldier. It only gave them a fright. With a muffled pop, the arrow was like a child playing with a knife. The lucky arrow pointed downward and pierced into the earth between the stone slabs, standing upright. At this moment, everyone on and below the city wall saw a scene that made their hearts tremble. A black-clothed person floated down from above the imperial city like a ghost emerging from the depths of the earth. Following the trajectory of the crossbow arrow, he swiftly flew down from the imperial city in the air where there was no point of contact. The black-clothed person moved very quickly. It was as if he was tearing through the air. From high above the palace walls, in the blink of an eye, he flew to the top of the rebel army's battle formation. The end of the last arrow had a rope tied to it. The black-clothed person used a grappling hook to slide down along the rope and kill his way into the rebel army camp. Like a black god descending, this scene dumbfounded countless people. They were intimidated by the powerful killing intent and aura in the air. Finally, someone reacted and discovered the rope tied to the end of the last arrow that had fallen heavily to the ground. He roared, "Cut the rope!" Numerous bright knives chopped at the rope tied tightly to the end of the arrow. The old Qin master's gaze grew slightly cold. Looking at the black shadow charging at him with incredible speed, the pain and anger in his heart exploded once again. His body trembled. The first prince's courageous attack and the black-clothed man's descent from the sky had unavoidably distracted him. In particular, the tragic death of his only son had caused this powerful figure to finally reveal a gap in his state of mind. Just as the old Qin master's state of mind trembled slightly, a knife light also lit up at the corner of his eyes. This knife light was not chopping toward the rope at the end of the arrow. Instead, it was chopping toward the old Qin master's body. A muffled crack exploded in the rebel army camp. Gong Dian's armor clanked wildly from the Xueqi in his body. The powerful Xueqi made his hair stand on end. His hands gripped the straight knife in his hands tightly and chopped toward the old Qin master's neck. This strike contained all of the power in Gong Dian's body. The power at the peak of the 8th level exploded into this strike that he had waited many years for. A glimmer of anger and disbelief flashed through the old Qin master's eyes. His face flushed red as his hand clamped down tightly on Gong Dian's brutal strike. Fresh blood dripped from between the old Qin master's thumb and index finger. Faced with this extremely sinister assassination attempt, the first elder of the Qing army, a superior 9th level ace, still trembled like he had when he saw Fan Xian descend from the sky. With just a slight tremble, the old Qin master's flushed face immediately became a deathly white. Gong Dian could no longer hold onto his long knife. There was another person who attacked at the same time as Gong Dian. A very heavy and powerful person. Yi Zhong's attack was very heavy. It was so heavy that it seemed to carry with it the wind and sand of the Dingzhou desert. It carried with it some mysterious intent. Decisively and mercilessly, it tore apart the body of a rebel general between him and the old Qin master and struck the old Qin master's abdomen. Yi Zhong and Gong Dian attacked the old Qin master at the same time. This scene happened too suddenly, too strangely, and too unbelievable. Even the old Qin master did not understand what meaning it contained. His personal family warriors had already escorted the crown prince to the side palace, but the 8 generals at his side could not react at all. After this massive muffled sound, dust and smoke rose up in the rebel army camp. The dust and smoke settled slightly. The 3 war horses under the 3 people were shaken by the powerful Xueqi. They didn't even have time to cry out before they exploded and died. The old Qin master spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. A terrifying wound appeared on his abdomen. His hand, which had quickly reached down like a withered bamboo, was already tightly gripping Yi Zhong's wrist that held the knife. Yi Zhong lowered his head. His brows were as steady as a mountain. The Xueqi in his body flowed out without holding back. With a muffled grunt, he took a step forward and pressed down again. The old Qin master's body trembled again. A powerful force exploded out from his old body. His left elbow flicked out. Holding Gong Dian's steel knife in his hand, the tip of his elbow had already smashed ruthlessly into Gong Dian's chest. With a pft, Gong Dian spat out a mist of blood that filled the air. However, he borrowed the momentum of spitting out blood to let out an explosive roar. Without any regard for his own safety, he pressed his entire body forward. With a press of the blade, the old Qin master's left hand was pressed against his neck, giving off a terrifying creaking sound. All of this happened in a very short amount of time. Yi Zhong knew that he only had one chance. Given his mountain-like personality, he would not pass it up. He took a deep breath and his chest expanded. His left hand shook and quickly became like a metal plate, breaking free of the old Qin master's unusually powerful control. This left hand became a metal plate. With the power of a coffin breaker, it landed heavily on the old Qin master's bleeding chest wound. The Yi family's hand skills were the best in the world. The powerful force of impact pushed the 3 top aces of the Qing military back on the stone floor. Along the way, they shattered the ground and sent up smoke and dust. At this moment, the rope behind the crossbow had been cut. Fan Xian, dressed in black, fell from midair. However, he did not fall into the encirclement of the rebel soldiers. Instead, the tip of his foot pushed off the helmet of a rebel soldier. Like a streak of smoke, he pierced straight into the rebel camp. Yi Zhong's coffin breaker landed viciously on the wound in the old Qin master's waist. Fan Xian shrunk into a ball of black shadow and immediately unfurled. With two swishing sounds, his left hand pulled out the sword of the Wei Emperor tied to his back. His right hand pulled out the black dagger he had taken from Lady Ning. With a sword in one hand and a dagger in the other, he turned into a streak of black smoke and swept past the heads of the 8 Qin family generals in the rebel camp. With a number of crisp sounds, 5 of the generals died with their throats slit. 3 of them retreated with chest injuries. Although it was only one exchange, Fan Xian had already unleashed the most power he had since his rebirth. Like a giant bird returning to the forest, he flew toward the 3 people fighting like wild beasts. The old Qin master who was injured let out a wild roar. With a flip of his hand, he pulled back his fingers and struck heavily on Yi Zhong's left shoulder, who did not care for his life and did not care about defense. The strike shattered Yi Zhong's left shoulder. The foot under his body stomped heavily on the ground, leaving a footprint, and brought his body flying backward. Yi Zhong gave a muffled grunt. Using the coffin breaker technique of closing the coffin, he locked onto the old Qin master's wildly overflowing and endlessly trembling right hand. Gong Dian's entire body was covered in blood. He wrapped one hand around the old Qin master's left arm and stuck his body to it. He used his body to press down on the 2 knives between the 2 of them. Through the old Qin master's powerful palm, he pressed down toward his neck. The 3 of them tangled together and quickly retreated over 30 meters. With a crash, they smashed through the wall of a wooden building at the back of the square and sent up countless clouds of dust. However, someone was faster than them. Fan Xian flew in like a black bird and arrived in front of the old Qin master like lightning. The long sword in his hand flipped and pierced into the old Qin master's lower abdomen with a clang. Blood blossomed as the long sword entered the body. Fan Xian lowered his head to hold the sword. With a muffled grunt, he continued to stab forward. The powerful force caused the bodies of the 4 warriors to smash through the second wall of the building, the third wall, and sent up countless clouds of dust. It hid this sinister, shameless and bloody murder in a place where tens of thousands of people could not see. The buildings and scenery around them flowed like they were going back in time. Fan Xian, Yi Zhong, and Gong Dian did not let go. Although these 3 sinister assassins knew that the old Qin master had suddenly been ambushed and had suffered injuries that were difficult to recover from under the combined attack of 2 9th-level aces and an 8th-level brave warrior, no one could predict what kind of brilliance this elder of the Qing military would explode with in the last moments of his life. With a muffled boom, this barbaric assassination was finally stopped in front of the last wall. Yi Zhong continued to use the coffin breaker technique to tightly grip the old Qin master's most powerful right hand. Gong Dian continued to press down on the old Qin master's left arm. Fan Xian still maintained his half-crouched stabbing position. His hands trembled as he held the blood-covered sword. Only the hilt of the sword was exposed outside the old Qin master's abdomen. The old Qin master's grizzled hair was disheveled, but a terrifying light still shone in his eyes. Like an old lion king on the verge of death, he suddenly let out an angry roar. His entire body began to tremble violently. The last counterattack of a 9th-level ace before death used this kind of violent tremor as an omen. From the wooden wall behind him, the tip of a sword suddenly and noiselessly extended out. The tip of the sword only protruded out 4 inches, but it just so happened to pierce into the old Qin master's body, the 3rd section of his tailbone. This mysterious sword thrust out and then retracted, disappearing without a trace. However, it was a fatal blow. Chapter 571. Silence. A death-like silence. Perhaps it was very long. Perhaps it was only an instant. Looking back 30 years, looking closer, it was 2 or 3 years. The wood shavings and broken pieces of tables and chairs that had been shattered by the Xueqi all around them fell with a rustle. Blood dripped down. Fan Xian slowly pulled out the sharp sword. The blade scraped against flesh and blood, making a wretched sound. Yi Zhong let go of the pair of iron hands. Gong Dian stood up, coughing up blood. The old Qin master's eyes were wide open. His body was soaked in blood as he sat by the wall. He had died with his eyes open. His hands were slightly open as if he was grabbing onto something. This elder figure of the Qing military had finally died. He had died in the most sinister murder that had been planned and hidden for the longest time since the founding of the Qing kingdom. Fan Xian was not injured at all, but he felt his body become slightly cold. Raising his head, He glanced at the silent Gong Dian to his right with a strange gaze. He looked at the first official of the guards he had met since he entered the capital at the age of 16. It was like he was looking at a monster. Then, he turned his head and glanced at Yi Zhong. He looked at Yi Zhong heavily. Coincidentally, Yi Zhong was also looking at him. Their gazes met. There were no sparks, but they each carried a sense of understanding, insight, and probing. Fan Xian knew that, in some sense, his gamble had already completely succeeded. The reason he dared to gamble on the royal palace was not because he already had some inside information. It was because when he had pressed down on the Empress Dowager's foot, he had thought of his grandmother's words in Danzhou. The emperor never fought a battle unprepared. The emperor's willpower was powerful beyond imagination. The emperor did not have any weaknesses. When Fan Xian was faced with a desperate situation, he did not believe that the emperor would not have left any backup in Jingdou. The emperor clearly knew the situation in Jingdou. How could he still go to Dong Mountain to worship heaven? Fan Xian wanted to gamble. He was gambling that some unexpected changes would occur in the rebel army. The changes had finally occurred. The Yi family had rebelled. No, it should be said that the most valiant spies in the history of the Qing kingdom had surfaced. However, when Fan Xian decided to gamble, he still could not convince himself why the Yi family would suddenly intervene, until he saw those things in Yi Zhong's eyes. Perhaps this glance only took a second, but it was enough for Fan Xian to understand many things. In the past, all the questions he had once doubted, all the things in the Qing court that appeared strange these 4 years, which proved the emperor's paranoia and exposed his flaws, all received a perfect explanation. Fan Xian only looked at Yi Zhong for a second, but he had already seen through everything that had happened in the past few years, even more than a decade. A month ago at the foot of Dong Mountain, Yi Luyun had come in a boat breaking through the waves. A sword came from beyond the heavens. It broke through the rocks and entered the precipice. Only the hilt of the sword remained outside the wall. At that time, Fan Xian was standing on the reef. He had been wounded by an arrow and had luckily escaped by sinking into the sea. Last year, in Suzhou, in the Baoyue brothel, Yi Luyun arrived wearing a bamboo hat. With one sword, he cut down half the building. For the sake of the Juanshang conference, he forcefully took away the accountant. At that moment, Fan Xian let loose a torrent of curses. He suffered internal injuries, but fortunately, he did not die. Given Yi Luyun's abilities and the might of a great grandmaster, he had allowed Fan Xian to meet him twice and not die. Using this as a line, it was clear to see the past events of the Qing kingdom. 2 years ago, while admiring chrysanthemums in the Hanging Temple, Gong Dian strangely left his post. There was a sudden assassination aimed at the Qing emperor. The building was in chaos, and Fan Xian was heavily injured. Yi Zhong gave chase but failed. The court was shocked, and the emperor was furious. He stripped Yi Zhong of his position as commander of the Jingdou garrison and sent him back to Dingzhou. Gong Dian was imprisoned and luckily returned. 2 years and 2 months ago, Fan Xian learned of the marriage between the second prince and Yi Ling'er in Shangjing. He was shocked and thought that the emperor was trying to force Yi Zhong to resign from his post so he would not be involved in the affairs of the princes. From this it went back to 8 years ago. At that time, Fan Xian was 12. On a cliff in Danzhou, he was bitterly practicing the tyrannical martial method. At that time, the singer Lu Yun had come and used Sanzhou to compare notes with Wu Zhu. After the Hanging Temple incident, Fan Xian and Chen Pingping had a long night of conversation. They both knew that the emperor had purposely arranged this matter to suppress the Yi family, remove Gong Dian from his position as deputy commander of the imperial army, and force Yi Zhong to leave Jingdou. At the time, he and Chen Pingping were confused. They thought that the emperor was too suspicious, but they also thought that this was a struggle between imperial power and the great grandmasters, so they did not think about it carefully. In dealing with the matter of the Yi family, the Qing emperor had clearly exposed his weakness of being overly suspicious. Although the method he used was obscure, it also lost its righteous style. At this moment, Fan Xian thought of the singer he first met when he was 12. He had long thought through all of this and finally understood. The emperor's paranoia, the emperor's blunder, was purposely showing weakness. Through the alienation of the Yi family, it gave the enemies under heaven the courage to attack. In 8 years, Fan Xian had never seriously thought about why of the 4 great grandmasters, the first one he saw was Yi Luyun. He had also never thought about why Yi Luyun, traveling the world, would go to Danzhou and so easily find Uncle Wu Zhu, whom many people wanted to find but could not. Where was Wu Zhu? No one under heaven knew, but some people knew that wherever Fan Xian was, Wu Zhu would be there. At that time, the only people who knew Fan Xian's true identity were the Emperor, Chen Pingping, and Fan Jian. Analyzing to this point, he understood everything. Yi Luyun had gone to Danzhou because someone had told him that Yi Qingmei's son was in Danzhou. Naturally, Wu Zhu was also in Danzhou. The person who had told him all of this was the emperor. In other words, the emperor had solemnly asked Yi Luyun to go to Danzhou and see his illegitimate child with a strange background. Naturally, such a person was the emperor's most trusted person. How could such a person betray the emperor? The emperor's paranoia, the Yi family's alienation, the marriage between the second prince and Yi Linger, and Yi Liuyun's sudden change in direction. All of this was actually just an illusion, or perhaps it was a price that had to be paid. These were just the details that made up a perfect infernal affairs. This plan had probably been constructed for a year, 2 years, 3 years. If one thought of Yi Liuyun's identity as a guest of the Juanshang conference, the time this plan had probably begun was more than a dozen years ago. Using such a long time and paying such a heavy price to hide it from everyone under heaven, including himself and the eldest princess's eyes, it could be said that this was the most terrifying infernal affairs in the history of the Qing kingdom. Compared to this, what did the Overwatch Council's Yan Ruihai and Yuan Hongdao count for? In just a second, countless images flashed through Fan Xian's mind. He withdrew his gaze and looked at the calm Yi Zhong. His body suddenly felt a chill as if he had fallen into an ice house. Even Chen Pingping probably did not know of this plan. The emperor's willpower was truly too terrifying. He looked at Yi Zhong. His lips were dry. From his clothes, he took out his special token and handed it over. In a trembling voice he asked, "Is the emperor still alive?" At that moment, Yi Zhong was also looking at the young duke. His emotions were complicated. When he had first attacked the old Qin master, he had not thought that Fan Xian on the palace walls would be able to mobilize the power to cooperate with him. His heart was also filled with shock. Had the emperor already told Sir Fan Jr. the entire plan? When Fan Xian opened his mouth, Yi Zhong asked at the same time, "Is the emperor still alive?" The exact same two questions shocked Fan Xian and Yi Zhong at the same time. Looking into each other's eyes, they felt a chill. Only now did they know that no one in Jingdou, regardless of whether it was Fan Xian, whom the emperor trusted incomparably, or Yi Zhong, the most important person in this plan, did not know whether the emperor was alive or dead. "Where is Li Yunrui?" Taiping courtyard. The two of them stopped talking. Yi Zhong accepted Fan Xian's token. Gong Dian picked up the old Qin master's body and quickly left in the direction of the square, where the sounds of killing had already shaken the heavens. Only a moment had passed since the assassination of Qin Yi. The people involved thought a lot. However, the formal conversation only consisted of these 2 sentences. The first sentence from both sides had already explained too many problems. Everyone was only a pawn in a large chessboard. They just had to do their part. Man proposes, God disposes. For now, they didn't know the situation at Dong Mountain and didn't need to think about it. Fan Xian took a few heavy breaths and forcefully suppressed the irritation brought about by the tyrannical Xueqi and medicine in his body. He dispersed some of the coldness in his heart and did not notice the small hole in the wall. For such a plan, the emperor had planned it for such a long time and exhausted so much energy. Naturally, the plan was great. Eliminating all opposition within the Qing kingdom was one part, but the emperor's true goal was probably far from that. Using Chen Pingping's words, "In this world, only the emperor stood at the highest and saw the furthest." Given the emperor's gaze, during these decades, he had always looked at the beautiful and elegant sights of the world, particularly the lands and people that temporarily did not belong to him. The main target of the Yi family's seamless plan was probably northern Qi and Dongyi. Ku He and Sigu Jian were both present on Dong Mountain, but Yi Luyun was the emperor's underling. The entire situation of the world had probably undergone a world-shaking change on that mountain. However, there were still some things Fan Xian did not understand. Even though Yi Luyun had abruptly turned against him at Dong Mountain, Ku He and Sigu Jian were extraordinary figures. With the 4 great grandmasters at Dong Mountain, even if Ku He and Sigu Jian were at a disadvantage, how could they be taken in by the emperor? Fan Xian furrowed his brows. It looked like the emperor had chosen Dong Mountain as the place to gather the overall situation. Most importantly, he was counting on Uncle Wu Zhu to take action. He knew Uncle Wu Zhu's personality. He would probably disappoint the emperor. The wretched cries of killing came from behind him and pulled him out of his complicated emotions. It reminded him that he was still beside the battlefield. The situation in Jingdo had not been settled. There were still countless people spilling hot blood for a plot that had been woven for many years. He took another deep breath and temporarily stopped thinking about the problem of Dong Mountain. Breaking through the wall, he disappeared into the heavy cover of private residences. In the instant before he moved, he suddenly felt a wave of sorrow. He suddenly felt sympathy for the eldest princess, the crown prince, the second prince, and the Qing soldiers fighting desperately in front of the royal palace. He also began to feel sympathy for himself. For the battle in Jingdo to reach such a level of ferocity, how much damage would it do to the Qing kingdom's national strength? Had the emperor, whose life and death was unknown, really not calculated? The 4 great grandmasters were at Dong Mountain. Even if the power of a sleeve or a finger was enough to shake the heavens and earth, could the emperor still be alive? Why did he take such a great risk and expend so much energy to do such a thing? Was it really to unify the world? Was it just for the title of Master of the World? At the same time that Yi Zhong, Gong Jia, and Fan Xian were assassinating the old Qin master, the middle-ranking Dingzhou generals, who had been silent the entire time, all met each other's eyes. They saw the determination and confusion in each other's eyes. It was not until the moment they entered the city that these generals had secretly received Commander Yi and General Gong's secret orders. In order to keep it a secret, it was impossible to mobilize the lower-ranking soldiers. However, the Yi family's Dingzhou army had to attack. They had already seen the strange scene in the rebel army's camp. However, soldiers were not robots that only listened to orders. For any army, when they were about to turn on the battlefield without any pre-battle mobilization, they would all appear confused. A moment ago, they were preparing to attack the royal palace. In the next moment, they suddenly had to turn their spears toward their own comrades. No matter how strict the military discipline of the Dingzhou army was, their battle power would probably drop to a very low point. Fortunately, the Dingzhou army's outstanding deputy generals and the middle-ranking generals who knew the inside story were talented enough to partially solve the problem of who they were fighting for. They isolated the second prince's trusted aides outside and surrounded the second prince. In a loud voice they yelled, "The second prince has an order. The crown prince has killed the monarch and his father. He is worse than a pig or a dog. Any Qing kingdom soldier can rise up and attack him. Kill." It was not until now that the second prince realized something was wrong. His face immediately paled. He didn't know why these generals, who had always been respectful and courteous, had surrounded him. He also didn't know why they had suddenly given such an absurd military order. Did his father-in-law see that the royal palace had opened and wanted to use this opportunity to get rid of the crown prince and help him ascend the throne? The second prince comforted himself like this in his heart. Only when he saw his trusted aide being shot down by the Dingzhou army and tied up on horseback did his heart grow cold. He knew that a change that neither he nor the crown prince had expected had occurred. Once the military order came out, the common soldiers of the Dingzhou army reacted quickly and attacked the Qin family's troops. Perhaps a portion of them actually believed this military order and thought that the crown prince's assassination plot had finally been exposed. The second prince had learned from his painful experience and decided to avenge the previous emperor. Most of the common soldiers thought that it was the second prince who had decided to take advantage of this opportunity to attack the crown prince. As for the latter judgment, all of the common people seemed to think this way. The attack of all of the Dingzhou soldiers finally succeeded in overcoming the most important problem of military morale among all the defections. Confident, they began to attack the Qin family as a matter of course. Of course, such a hurried defection would not be able to demonstrate the true power of the Dingzhou army. Fortunately, the Qin family still had a large number of soldiers. However, the old Qin master had suddenly died. Qin Hung had been stabbed to death by Jing Ji's spear, and a few generals had escorted the crown prince to the back of the camp. Of the 8 generals on the front lines, 5 had been killed and 3 wounded. It could truly be said that they were a group of dragons without a leader. For an army with slightly more stable morale to attack an army without a leader to command them, victory or defeat was not difficult to predict. On the chaotic battlefield, other than the Dingzhou army, Not many people heard the military orders of the Yi family generals. There were still many people fighting with all their might. Even if it wasn't to kill the enemy, it was to protect their own lives. Covered in blood, the great prince brandished the long knife in his hand and opened a bloody path. Although he was unable to charge into the rebel army's camp, he successfully met up with the remaining Black Knights. In the fierce battle, he did not see the scene of Fan Xian, Yi Zhong, and Gong Dian attacking at the same time. He thought he had reached the end of his road. Fresh blood dripped from his hand, but his expression was solemn. As a prince of the Qing kingdom, he had fought for the royal palace until now without a glimmer of regret in the depths of his heart. A thunderous sound of horse hooves rang out. The Dingzhou cavalry, which had been resting, finally charged over. The great prince narrowed his eyes slightly and glanced at the already exhausted Jinggu. Tightening the knife hilt in his hand, he was about to chop down. However, the Dingzhou cavalry swept past in front of them and did not attack at all. Instead, they charged ruthlessly toward the Qin family army. Kill! Chapter 572. The sound of killing shook the sky. Suddenly and without any warning, countless riders covered in Dingzhou dust began to attack the Qin family from all directions in the square. A group of about 1,000 cavalrymen, like a sickle, sharply swept across the royal palace. The scaling ladders that towered up to the top of the royal palace were, in a flash, like ripe grains in a paddy field. With a crash, they were neatly cut off at the root. The ears of wheat were always heavy. There were a number of rebel soldiers bravely climbing up the scaling ladders. They had no idea that friendly soldiers would attack them from below. The defenses at the bottom of the scaling ladders had not considered this problem. So many three-part scaling ladders collapsed miserably from the two sides toward the center. The rebel soldiers on them cried out wretchedly as they fell from high above like grains falling from a harvest. Many people fell to their deaths on the ground, spilling out blood and internal organs. They were then pressed to the bottom by the layers of scaling ladders that randomly fell to the ground like rice stalks. The rebel soldiers who had already reached the palace walls suddenly felt something strange behind them and couldn't help but feel shocked. On the contrary, the remaining Imperial Army and Overwatch Council subordinates in the palace walls discovered that the situation on the battlefield below had suddenly changed and found their last chance of survival. Courage immediately surged into their chests. The people defending the royal palace charged forward and surrounded the rebel soldiers who had reached the palace walls, forcing the Qin family soldiers, who no longer had a path of retreat, into a hopeless situation. There were already rebel soldiers breaking through the front doors of the royal palace and carrying out a sudden attack. They had no idea what was happening behind them. The Yi family's two groups of riders approached from the west and Taiping Square. After sweeping through the scaling ladders, they did not slow down at all. They rode directly into the pitch-black front doors of the royal palace and launched an attack behind the rebel soldiers entering the palace. On the square, the Dingzhou army, which had taken an advantageous position, had long begun their counterattack against the Qin family. Too many of the Qin family's upper-level generals had died or been injured. Additionally, the incident had happened suddenly. For a moment, they were unable to organize an effective defense or counterattack. On the battlefield, what decided victory or defeat was often the moment the battle began. The generals of the Dingzhou army carried out the secret order the commander had given them before they entered the city. With a thunderous force, they attacked and caught the Qin family's army unprepared. For a moment, the rebel soldiers suffered heavy casualties. The scales of victory and defeat had already tipped toward the Dingzhou army. As for why the scales were tipped, that was something that not everyone could understand. This was especially so for the Imperial Army and Shadow Cavalry in the center of the square. They had already gone through 4 hours of desperate fighting and were extremely exhausted. Seeing that they were about to face death, their eyes were wide open and they were clearly at a loss. The great prince, covered in blood, stood together with Jinggu, who had his head lowered. They looked in shock at the murderous cries around them, the black smoke, the light of the knife, and the shadow of the sword. They listened to the grunts, wretched wails, and sorrowful cries in the square. They discovered that the long knife in their hands was actually very heavy. The rebel army suddenly began to attack each other. The Qin family was unable to protect themselves, and the Dingzhou army purposely avoided the area in the middle of the square. The great prince and the people protecting the royal palace stood in a daze on the empty ground, not understanding what had happened. A moment ago, They were still fighting with their lives on the line. In the next moment, they seemed to have become pure spectators. What happened in Jingdo seemed to have nothing to do with them. The great prince glanced at the wounded Jinggo at his side and furrowed his brows. As the commander of the Western Expedition Army, he knew how important one's reaction on the battlefield was. Regardless of what problems were happening within the rebel army, if he wanted to use this opportunity, he had to immediately give the order to gather the nearly 2,000 remaining effective forces inside and outside the palace. However, there was a loss in his eyes because the inside and outside of the palace had already been divided into a number of battle zones. It was impossible for the imperial army to band together. Furthermore, from the bottom of his heart, the great prince did not want these exhausted subordinates to once again leave this rare moment of safety and throw themselves into the flames of battle. Thus, he had to see clearly what the Dingzhou army's sudden betrayal meant. Did the second prince want to use this opportunity to get rid of the crown prince and take the throne himself? But, why did the Dingzhou army purposely stay away from the imperial army and work hard to protect the royal palace? He suddenly thought of everything Fan Xian had done since the early hours of the morning. His heart thumped. Did Fan Xian know that the Yi family would make a move? Was that why he had sent out those orders to find a good opportunity for the other party? At this moment, a member of the imperial guard rushed to his side and whispered a few words into his ear. He briefly explained what had happened in the rebel army's camp that someone had noticed earlier. The great prince's eyes lit up slightly. He looked at the Dingzhou army shuttling around him, the Qin family troops retreating step by step not far away, and the dragon flag where the crown prince was. He finally relaxed a little. His admiration for Fan Xian grew a little stronger. Urgent military orders rang out from all around them. Amidst the dust and smoke filling the air, the powers of all sides gathered and charged. The great prince led the remaining 200 people and the imperial soldiers who had returned from Taiping Square. Fortunately, they met up together and slowly pressed toward the royal palace. In the distance, hidden by the dust and smoke, the bright yellow dragon flag could faintly be seen leaving the square. The entire square had become a battlefield of carnage. Although the Qin family's rebel army had suffered heavy casualties, they had more people than the Dingzhou army. Although the military orders did not go their way, they still made the Dingzhou army pay a great price by relying on the Qing army's naturally outstanding individual soldier qualities. The scene was chaotic. All of the Qing soldiers had become countless small battle groups and were fighting together. This situation had arisen because, at the very beginning, the Dingzhou army had received the crown prince's edict and was prepared to change formations with the Qin family. This created the chaos. Along the line of the royal palace, there were battles happening on all sides. People were dying everywhere, and there were wretched cries everywhere. The autumn sun hung high in the sky and finally pierced through the smoke around the royal palace, illuminating everything clearly. Blood flowed all over the ground, particularly where there was a moat on 3 sides of the royal palace. The blood had already seeped into the river. Many of the dead and wounded soldiers also fell miserably into the river. Some of the rebel soldiers who had not completely died were soaked in the cold moat water and woke up. However, they were powerless to struggle ashore. Wretchedly and powerlessly, they sank into the river. It looked like there were countless water ghosts in the moat pulling at their ankles. Faced with the Dingzhou army's sudden attack, the Qin family managed to hold out for a while before finally retreating in defeat. A few generals protected the crown prince and led the group that had gathered back away from the square. Following the streets of Jingdo, they began to retreat toward the city gate guards that the rebel soldiers still controlled. The dragon flag retreated, and the army lost again. The Dingzhou army cried out in unison and charged forward bravely. Immediately, the battlefield once again spread from the 3 li around the royal palace toward Jingdo. Chasing and being chased, killing and being killed, arrows flew wildly, and knives and spears struck out viciously. All of Jingdo began to tremble. They knew that they would face an upheaval and bloodbath that had not been seen in 16 years. Thud, thud, thud. A series of heavy horse hooves cut through the remaining smoke on the ground. With the general on the horse, they appeared in front of the imperial army and black knights below the royal palace in this corner that seemed to have been forgotten by the rebel army. Countless sounds of metal colliding rang out. No one gave an order. There was no need for an order. These exhausted imperial soldiers and black knights, who had suffered heavy casualties, suddenly exploded with spirit. They quickly changed their formation and surrounded the general and the soldiers behind him. The expressions of the soldiers behind the general changed dramatically. They all drew their knives from their sheaths. The great prince slowly walked out. Looking at the familiar figure on the horse, he furrowed his brows and maintained his silence. Yi Zhong slowly raised his right arm. The dozens of soldiers slowly put away their knives with wary expressions. However, they still nervously watched the remaining soldiers who had once given them countless mental blows. Earlier on the square, these hundreds of riders had charged twice and thrown the rebel army into chaos. Spears pointed at Qin Heng and knives cut through tens of thousands of soldiers. It was truly terrifying. I will move 3,000 soldiers to help your highness defend the city. Yi Zhong looked at the blood-covered great prince in front of him. A glimmer of admiration flashed through his eyes, but his tone remained calm. Gong Dian will arrive immediately. He will help your highness control the situation. The great prince looked at him and still did not speak. Yi Zhong had already reached into his clothes and took out a token. He tossed it toward the great prince from a distance. The great prince raised his aching right arm and caught it. Looking closely, he saw that it was the token that Fan Xian had taken from his subordinate in the early hours of the morning. He involuntarily furrowed his brows. Raising his head to look at Yi Zhong's steady figure on the horse, he asked, "Father!" He only said 2 words before Yi Zhong interrupted him. He knew what the great prince wanted to ask, but he had no idea how to answer. There were no idiots in the royal family. When Yi Zhong revealed his identity and had Fan Xian's token as a keepsake, the great prince was already certain of Yi Zhong's role in this rebellion. He also knew that a figure of Yi Zhong's level was not someone that Fan Xian could persuade. It could only be said that before his father left the capital, he had already made arrangements for the Dingzhou soldiers who had pretended to come forward to offer up prisoners of war. The great prince took a deep breath and didn't say anything more. He directly gave the order, "Give chase." He knew that Yi Zhong was waiting for his order. Although the Qin family had already been defeated and the sounds of killing still lingered in the square, the Yi family's Dingzhou army had, in reality, already controlled the entire situation in Jingdou. Yet, Yi Zhong still wanted to see him. He needed him, the commander of the imperial army, the eldest son of the royal family, to give Yi Zhong an order. Given the current situation, the power in his hands already allowed Yi Zhong to control Jingdou. However, he didn't want and didn't dare let anyone have this kind of speculation after the fact, so he was particularly respectful toward the great prince. The flames of war had already spread into Jingdou. Unavoidably, it affected the commoners who had closed their doors for a day and night. There were tragic battles happening everywhere. The Dingzhou cavalry had already chased after the Qin family's main camp toward the 9 city gates of Jingdou. However, the crown prince was not below the dragon flag. This young man, who was about to break into the royal palace and become the new monarch of the Qin kingdom, had suddenly been struck across the waist. His dream had been shattered in front of his eyes. His expression had long become ghastly. Fortunately, the Qin family's loyal generals reacted quickly and led the remaining soldiers to carve out a bloody path. Li Chengqian didn't want to retreat because he knew that he only had the Qin family's army in his hands. If he left Jingdou, although the world was large, where would he find shelter? Probably even his aunt had not thought that the Yi family would betray him. A bitter smile rose to the corners of the young crown prince's lips. The jolting of the warhorse beneath him did not cause his frozen expression to change at all. Earlier, he had been thinking about how to win the Yi family over from the side of the second prince after he ascended the throne and become a true emperor. He was also thinking about how to resist the pressure of his aunt, mother, grandmother, and old Qin master and pardon the civil officials on the city walls who were determined to oppose him, particularly the scholars Xu and Hu. Who would have thought that the Yi family would betray him like this? His aunt probably still didn't know this shocking news. His mother and grandmother were still trapped on the city walls, and the old Qin master was already dead. The crown prince felt a sharp pain in his chest. He almost couldn't stand straight on his horse. At his side, a rebel general said with tears in his eyes, "Your Highness, as long as we get out of the city and gather soldiers, Shao Mountain, and our people, we can charge straight north and meet up with Governor Yan. The matter will definitely succeed." These words were reasonable, but Li Chengqian didn't really believe it. Fan Xian had returned alive. Governor Yan was probably also dead. Since the Yi family had betrayed, great-uncle Lu Yun was probably... Li Chengqian sighed in his heart. Following the horse toward the city gates, he didn't know what kind of waves were surging in his heart. Below the city walls, one of the main conspirators of the rebellion, the second prince, was looking at his father-in-law with a venomous and hopeless gaze. Before Yi Zhong personally led the Dingzhou army in pursuit, for some reason, he had returned to his camp and glanced at his son-in-law. If you want to live, you have to remember everything the Dingzhou army said today. The second prince's entire body was restrained. He stood wretchedly under his horse. He raised his head and looked fiercely at Yi Zhong as he spat. He knew what Yi Zhong's words meant. The Dingzhou army's final betrayal was nominally because he wanted to avenge his father and carry out his father's posthumous edict. However, he knew that was not the case. Of all the people involved, the one who felt the most hopeless, shocked, and angry was the second prince. He had no idea that on Dong Mountain, the Qing emperor had specifically said to Fan Xian that if possible, he should leave the second prince alive. At such a moment, the second prince had never thought he could survive. What made him most angry was that he seemed to have planned for a long time. In the end, he was the stupidest person. Everything that he had done now seemed so ridiculous, so comical. His eyes were filled with anger. His usually gentle expression appeared particularly dark and cold. Father-in-law, you are truly a good dog. However, if father truly dies, what will you do? Yi Zhong didn't say anything. He slowly turned his horse around. The expression on his face became somewhat dim. Behind him, the second prince yelled, "You bunch of liars!" At this moment, a heavy object suddenly fell from above the royal palace walls and struck viciously against the hard stone tiles with a muffled thud. The person who fell was wearing beautiful and luxurious clothing. Having suffered such a heavy blow, all the bones in her body were broken. Blood flowed freely. She had long died. However, her head was perfectly preserved, revealing a dignified and haggard face filled with despair and madness. Chapter 573. Writing the first few chapters was too exhausting. These 2 days have made me tired. I need to take a break. Looking at the Empress body on the ground and the pool of flesh and blood, everyone was shocked speechless. Yi Zhong said a few words in a low voice. He then turned his horse around and began to chase toward the city gate. The Qin family's strength was still very powerful. He had to quickly communicate with the soldiers in all directions and attack to the end. Secondly, the Empress had died in front of him. For his own safety, it was best to hide as far away as possible. It was best to leave the matters of the royal family to the great prince and the Duke of Donbo to handle. The Empress' suicide as she fell from the city gate was outside of many people's expectations. Although the Crown Prince's army had been defeated and the Empress' fate would not be good, no one had thought that the outwardly gentle but inwardly useless Empress would, in the last moment of her life, summon such courage. At this time, the killing on the palace walls had not ended. The Qin family's rebel army was still stubbornly resisting. Fan Xian and the great prince's trusted subordinates were concerned about the Empress Dowager and officials' safety. They also did not ignore the Empress' existence. However, they did not have the extra energy to guard against the mournful leap. The Empress jumped down and died in front of tens of thousands of people. This scene was shocking to the core. The second prince stared at the Empress' body in a daze like an idiot. Suddenly, he began to tremble from the tips of his toes to the top of his head. His entire body was enveloped by coldness as he trembled endlessly. He didn't know what kind of end he was about to face. Unconsciously, he raised his head and looked. After confirming that his birth mother, Lady Xu, was safe, he collapsed to the ground. At his side, Dingzhou soldiers had already helped him up. Respectfully and warily, they surrounded him in the center, terrified that something would happen to him. The second prince's face was expressionless, but his gaze was unfocused. He thought to himself, things have already gotten to this point. If someone wants to die, who can stop them? The Qin family's army had already retreated. The Dingzhou army continued to give chase. Jingdo was filled with the sounds of killing, particularly the group of rebel soldiers with the dragon flag. They moved with extraordinary speed through the long streets, passed by Zhangyang Gate, which Zhang Duqing personally guarded, and sped out of Jingdo. Zhang Duqing's face was ashen as he watched the scene in front of him. He didn't know what he was feeling. Loyalty was a belief that needed to be upheld for a lifetime. Even if it wavered at the last moment, the loyalty of the first half of his life would become a foundation for treachery. He knew he had no chance to turn things around. He also didn't have the courage to use the 3,000 soldiers of the city gate department and the 9 city gates to help the Qin family slow the Dingzhou army. The city gates could only guard against the people outside the city. How could they guard against the people inside? Zhang Deqing let out a long gloomy sigh. He took one last look at Zhangyang Gate, which seemed to flash with a golden light under the blazing sunlight. He led his personal guards, followed the dragon flag, and followed the rebel army as they began to flee. Zhangyang Gate didn't even have time to close when the Dingzhou army led by Gong Dian charged over. Turning into a yellow dragon, they gave chase. The fleeing crown prince used the dragon flag as a smokescreen. He was surrounded and protected by the few remaining generals of the Qin family as he arrived at Donghua Gate. The old Qin master and Qin Hang were both dead. At this moment, the rebel army was like a group of dragons without a leader. Fortunately, the family generals the old Qin master had sent to protect the crown prince were still alive. At such a critical moment, they had thought of this escape method. They intended to leave the capital and head north to meet up with the northern expedition camp in Songzhou. However, the crown prince's heart had long become dim. Since there was foreshadowing in the capital, perhaps Governor Yan was already dead. Where could he escape to? He still didn't know that his mother had fallen to the city walls and died. He took a deep breath and forcefully raised his spirits a moment later. He thought to himself that if his father had truly died, with his aunt's help, he might be able to rise again. After all, he was the crown prince. The world was named Li and not Fan. Even if he controlled Jingdou, he might not be able to control the world. However, the glimmer of fighting spirit that he had raised with great difficulty was instantly shattered by the 2 tightly shut city gates in front of him. The crown prince and the generals looked with ashen faces at the city gate guards waiting with arrows on the stone steps on either side of Donghua Gate. They looked at the white-clothed official beside the general and their hearts tightened. The crown prince recognized the white-clothed official. He knew that he was the third-ranking figure in the Overwatch Council, Yan Bingyun, whom his father greatly admired. However, he had already received news that when he was trying to convince Zhang Deqing, he had already been taken down by his aunt's people and rescued by someone else. How had he come here? Crown Prince, please wait. Yan Bingyun's white robes were still stained with blood from Ling Chen's fatal attack. He coughed with a serious expression. After the black-clothed man who had saved his life placed him in a safe area, he had disappeared without a trace. No one knew where he had gone. Yan Bingyun was unable to personally participate in the events that happened in Jingdou during this half a day. Through one of the remaining channels, he watched everything nervously. When there was a strange movement in the square, he had already arrived at Donghua Gate. No Yamen was united. Even if Zhang Deqing had been the commander of the city gate guards for 20 years, it was impossible for him to command all of his subordinates to be of the same mind in today's situation, especially when the rebel army had been defeated. Yan Bingyun knew he was taking a risk, but he liked the feeling of taking risks. Furthermore, he felt that after making a big mistake, he had to make up for something and do something for Sir Fan Jr. Fortunately, he succeeded this time. The city gate guard successfully blocked the crown prince at Donghua Gate. The emperor's strict control over the city gate guards made the commander of Donghua Gate stand firmly by Fan Xian's side after learning the specific situation. Perhaps, he stood on the side of his own glory, splendor, and wealth. If the crown prince was allowed to lead his troops out of Jingdou and contact the soldiers in the wilderness, who knew what changes would happen in the future? The rebel army wholeheartedly wanted to break out of the city and did not give Yan Bingyun much time to negotiate. Without asking the crown prince, the generals of the Qin family began to prepare for battle. Hearing a military order, the rebel army bravely charged toward Donghua Gate. Arrows flew in unison from both sides, and there were heavy casualties. Not long after the battle began, the crown prince's face paled. He heard a thunderous roar coming from behind him. It was the Dingzhou cavalry. A flag fluttered in the wind in the streets of Jingdou and quickly approached Donghua Gate. There was a large Yi written on the flag. Yi Zhong had personally led the troops here. To his surprise, he found that Donghua Gate was already closed. The rebel army the crown prince was in was blocked in front of the not-so-wide city gate. Densely packed, they took up half the main street. He took a deep breath. He knew that Donghua Gate could not be held for much longer. Raising his right arm, he prepared to carry out the bloodiest part of the Jingdou incident. He had not expected that the rebel army's violent attack on Donghua Gate would gradually slow. After Yi Zhong caught up, the crown prince's head had been lowered the entire time, resting on his chest. No one knew what he was thinking. Then he slowly raised his head. His eyes were filled with a dimness and relief. He opened his mouth and said, "Surrender." Everyone fell silent. They looked at the crown prince with disbelief, anger, grief, hopelessness, and confusion. They didn't know why he had suddenly lost all will to fight. The crown prince's gaze slowly swept across the faces of the generals and soldiers who followed him loyally. He knew that if he fought to the death, it was not impossible for him to kill his way out of the city. However, this matter had progressed to this point. The crown prince was tired, and hopeless. So what if he killed his way out of the city? From Jingdo to Zhengzhou was thousands of li away. Was he going to let these thousands of soldiers die one by one in this endless pursuit? Was he going to let the army fight, kill, and set fire to the fertile land of the Qing people? The crown prince turned his horse's head and looked at Yi Zhong in the distance through the forest of spears that filled the street. "General Yi, I don't want to leave." Yi Zhong furrowed his brows slightly. He didn't understand why the scene in front of him had occurred. No matter what, he would never have guessed the change in the crown prince's mentality. He always thought the crown prince had other thoughts. Since the crown prince had spoken, it seemed that there was a chance. Yi Zhong didn't want his Dingzhou army to pay even more casualties. "Your Highness is wise." Li Chengqian's position as crown prince had already been stripped by Fan Xian in the palace. However, Yi Zhong still said it out of habit. Li Chengqian laughed bitterly and then said, "I have a condition." "Please speak, Crown Prince." "I want to see Fan Xian. He must promise me one thing." Li Chengqian's face immediately became cold. It wasn't because he understood something. As a son of the Li family, as the crown prince who had been raised as the next ruler for many years, he faintly guessed what kind of fate the hand in the sky wanted to mold in Jingdo. He didn't want to submit to that fate. At the very least, he wanted the hand to be hit by some small pebbles when it was molding clay figurines. Yi Zhong was silent for a moment. He then said, "I don't know where Duke Fan is right now." A strange light flashed through Li Chengqian's eyes. He immediately guessed something. His expression became ugly. He began to worry about the safety of certain people. He thought to himself that his condition had not yet fallen into Fan Xian's ears. Would it be too late? Yi Zhong was lying because he could guess where Fan Xian was. In Jingdo, which had basically become a sea of blood, regardless of whether it was the rebel soldiers or the people who had accepted Fan Xian's power as regent, they had all lost track of him. Ever since the old Qin master was assassinated, Duke Fan, who was in charge of Jingdo's affairs, could no longer be found. The crown prince, who had made up his mind in front of Donghua Gate, guessed Fan Xian's whereabouts at the first instant. Yi Zhong was able to guess it because he had personally told Fan Xian the address. The crown prince was able to guess it because he cared deeply about everything there and the people there. Fan Xian was in Taiping Courtyard. Dressed in black, he stood on one side of Lujing River and looked at the scenery on the other side. His entire person merged into the shadows of the trees. If one didn't look carefully, it was impossible to see him. This was already the outskirts of Jingdo. After he killed Qin Yi, he had used his fastest speed to take advantage of the chaos in Jingdo to cross the tall city walls and come here. In this royal courtyard were his wife, Lin Waner, who he cared about the most, De Bao, and the eldest princess, who had single-handedly planned the Dong Mountain incident and the Jingdo rebellion. Fan Xian was not unfamiliar with Taiping Courtyard. More accurately, he was extremely familiar with it. This manor had been his family's property 20 years ago. It was where his mother, Yi Qingmei, had lived after coming to the Qing kingdom. After the Yi family was destroyed, this manor had been taken back by the royal family. However, the emperor had always sealed up Taiping Courtyard and used internal guards to watch it, forbidding any member of the royal family from entering. Only then did its reputation gradually disappear. During the summer and autumn of the 4th year of the Qing calendar, Fan Xian had once taken his sister to look across the river. At that time, the river wind caressed their bodies, making them sigh. Fan Xian didn't understand why the eldest princess would choose Taiping Courtyard as her residence for directing Jingdo matters. At this moment, he had no time to think about this. How to safely rescue Wan and De Bao was the most important thing. Although Wana was the eldest princess' own daughter, Fan Xian could not guarantee that after personally seeing so many years of planning come to such a tragic end, that crazy woman wouldn't become unrecognizable to her own family. During these 10 days, he had always known what kind of situation Juan was in, but he still had no way to solve it. He also did not reveal a glimmer of worry in front of others. Only he knew how Juan and Dabao's safety affected his emotions. Standing on this side of the river and looking at the other side, Fan Xian's heart throbbed slightly. Only now did he understand that Juan was more important in his heart than he had imagined. Wu Zhu had once personally told him about the layout of the rooms in Taiping Courtyard. Furthermore, Wu Zhu had once gone deep into the courtyard to retrieve something. After Fan Xian came to the other side of the courtyard, he carefully examined the defenses of the quiet and secluded courtyard. It was much weaker than he had imagined. It looked like the Overwatch Council and his ceaseless attacks on Xinjiang these years had indeed had some effect. The aces by the eldest princess side had been greatly reduced. While the sounds of killing shook the heavens in Jingdo, the Taiping courtyard on the outskirts of the capital was completely silent. This sharp contrast made it so that Fan Xian did not dare to move lightly. When Taiping courtyard was first built, its location was special. It was actually built on a small peninsula in the middle of Lujing River. There was only one passageway into the courtyard. The surrounding riverbanks were all relatively lower and shallower. Fan Xian observed for a long time from the treetops and branches. He found that his line of sight was blocked by the courtyard walls. It was impossible to see the situation inside. The design of the courtyard walls was very clever. It was not very high, but it just so happened to block all the lines of sight from the outside. Fan Xian's lips tasted bitter. He knew that even if he brought in a sniper rifle, it would not be of much use. Thinking of this, his heart couldn't help but thump. He thought to himself, when my mother designed this courtyard, did she ever think of defending against a sniper rifle? However, there was no courtyard in the world that could not be attacked. Otherwise, the Yi girl would not have disappeared from the Qing kingdom 20 years ago. Fan Xian was just a bit afraid of harming the innocent. He didn't attack forcefully because he knew that Li Yunrui's move had indeed caught him where it hurt. He didn't think for long on this side of the river. Fan Xian's expression calmed. Taking a deep breath, he turned toward a bridge in the bamboo that he had once passed. Like he was taking a stroll, he walked to the front door of Taiping Courtyard. Behind the bamboo forest on the wall, many people suddenly appeared and surrounded Fan Xian in the center. These were the eldest princess personal guards. They looked at him with faces full of shock. They had long recognized his identity and didn't understand why he would appear like this at such a time. Chapter 574. Fan Xian stood at the door of Taiping Courtyard and looked sideways at the faint green in the courtyard. After he said those words, he didn't say another word. A dozen aces from Xinjiang looked at him with faces full of astonishment. They didn't know what had happened in Jingdo. How could this commissioner of the Overwatch Council, who should have been trapped in the royal palace, suddenly appear in front of Taiping Courtyard's door? A gust of wind blew through the bamboo forest, calmly and faintly removing some of the heat around them. The Xinjiang aces gave a low cry and charged toward Fan Xian. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and retreated. His left arm seemed to be able to twist and strike out. His fist, which had reached its limit, suddenly opened. Like an old tree opening its leaves, it slapped the side of an ace's face with a slap. Although it didn't land, it still made half of the ace's teeth fall out. Fresh blood flowed as he fell to the ground and fainted. Fan Xian stood on the tips of his toes. The tyrannical Xueqi in his body surged out. His entire body shrunk. Like a faint shadow, he charged backward out of the encirclement, looking at the people who gritted their teeth and charged over. His eyes became even more bloodshot. His hands trembled slightly. Just as he had said to Sir Yan Jr. when he first set the time, the present Jingdo was basically an empty city for Fan Xian. The most powerful figures in the world that could threaten him had all been attracted to Dong Mountain by the emperor. Regardless of whether it was the northern Qi aces or the numbing 9th-level swordsman in Dongyi, they were all attracted by that jade-like mountain like a magnet. There were only 3 9th-level aces in Jingdo. The old Qin master was already dead, and Yi Zhong was on his side. Fan Xian had confidence that as long as he didn't sink into a chaotic army, who could kill him? However, he had no way of knowing Juan and Dabao's whereabouts, so he didn't attack forcefully. Thus, he gambled again and came outside Taiping courtyard to knock on the door. Perhaps this was a bit arrogant, but it was actually a kind of helplessness. Faced with the eldest princess's methods, even someone as dark and ruthless as Fan Xian could only temporarily shed his tyrannical nature and find another way. However, these Xinjiang aces did not know that Sir Fan Jr. was preparing to attack with words. Amidst their shock, they attacked with all their strength. In just one exchange, someone was heavily injured. No one knew what kind of bloody battle would follow. The aces charging toward Fan Xian suddenly stopped their steps. The crossbows sticking out of the walls of Taiping courtyard also raised their arrowheads and no longer pointed at Fan Xian. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly and looked at the crossbow bolts. He couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. However, there were always too many helpless things in life. If he wanted Wan'er and Dabao to be safe, he could only lean toward the Tiger Mountain in front of him. No one stopped Fan Xian from entering the courtyard again. Countless eyes watched his every move, whether openly or secretly. If he reacted in the slightest, the real attack would probably begin. Because at this time, from the Taiping courtyard came an extremely elegant and faint sound of a zither. The sound was like the gurgling of flowing water, calming one's heart and mind, causing those who heard it to feel uneasy and at ease. Since the princess had already given the order through the sound of the guqin, the aces throughout Taiping courtyard would no longer stop Fan Xian from entering. However, they had endless questions in their hearts. Why did the princess want Fan Xian to enter? Did she not know how terrifying Fan Xian was? Why didn't she take advantage of the fact that Fan Xian had come alone to kill him in one blow? A dozen people slowly escorted or watched Fan Xian into the front door of Taiping courtyard. They then stopped in front of the second bridge. In front of them was a forbidden area. Without the eldest princess's personal order, no one was allowed to enter. Fan Xian stood in front of the bridge and lowered his head to look at the wooden planks on the bridge. There were gaps between the planks through which he could see the clear river water below. The section of Lujing River in Taiping courtyard was separated by a stone path to the island. It formed a pool of slow water like a level lake. The surface of the water seemed to be forever still and would not flow. The quiet and peaceful sound of the zither came from the inner courtyard across the bridge and gently entered his ears. He lowered his head to look at the flowing water and tilted his ear to listen to the sound of the zither. It was as if he wanted to judge the current state of mind of the player. A moment later, he carefully tidied his clothes and stepped onto the bridge. Walking steadily to the island, he pushed open the wooden door to the inner courtyard and raised his eyes to look calmly at the woman gently stroking the strings of the zither under the pavilion by the lake in the center of the island. Raising his hands, he bowed respectfully and said, "Greetings, Your Highness." The sound of the zither did not stop at all because of this sudden greeting. That pair of slender fingers and white wrists plucked and stroked on the zither. It was still very steady. Li Yunrui lowered her head slightly. It was as if she was putting all of her attention on the 7 strings of the zither in front of her. However, her wrist lowered slightly. Her fingertips slid to the right end. Compared to the quiet sound earlier, the sound of the zither seemed even more reserved and elegant. The little lake in the center of the island was rippled by the autumn wind. The stones by the lake were green and contrasted beautifully with the short, shallow hill around them. There was a pavilion on the hill, but the person and the zither were not in the pavilion. Instead, they were under a flowering tree. The stamens of the flowers on the tree were a faint pink. No one knew what they were called. The autumn wind ruffled the green pond and brushed against the tops of the flowering trees. The water moved and petals fell like rain. They landed on the eldest princess' wide-sleeved ancient robes like a slightly darker flower shadow. Fan Xian looked quietly in that direction. He looked at Li Yunrui's calm and indifferent face that still could not hide its charm. Today, the eldest princess had not put on grand makeup. She had only slightly raised the tips of her brows, but her natural and romantic aura filled the entire garden. A head of beautiful black hair fell behind her shoulders. She had only used a silk handkerchief to pull it up behind her head. It made her appear even more elegant and at ease. She was playing the zither with her head lowered. Her eyelids were slightly lowered. Her long eyelashes gently rested on her jade-like skin. It made Fan Xian involuntarily think of the pair of eyes his wife had inherited from her. If one didn't know who she was and didn't purposely think of her age, then any man would have to admit this woman's charm. Fan Xian walked along the green stones by the lakeside. He narrowed his eyes slightly in the sound of the zither. He then opened his mouth and said, "Yan Xiaoyi is dead." The sound of the zither continued to hum softly. Occasionally, it would rise and make a few vibrating sounds to show that she had long known of this matter and didn't need to say more. "Qin Hang is dead," Fan Xian said quietly as he stared at her hands. 2 fingers of Li Yunrui's right hand slid across the 4th string and pressed it a few times. The zither under her fingers made a leisurely sound. Fan Xian didn't hesitate for a moment. His plain and powerful words pressed forward. "Qin Yi is also dead." Li Yunrui still did not raise her head. The speed at which the 7 strings of the zither moved became slower and slower. It gradually became more sorrowful. However, the zither was elegant and light. It was sorrowful but not hurtful. The light thoughts of separation could be seen clearly. However, in the slight trembling of the wide sleeves behind her hands, it was faintly possible to capture the eldest princess's emotions. Suddenly, the sound of the zither rose again. However, the sound of the zither had always been deep and elegant. No matter how fast the fingers moved, the range of the sound was always limited within that range. The playing, which should have been filled with hostility, used a slowness that was completely different from the speed to declare Yongjing's sense of purity. Only those who were confident could play the correct sound. Fan Xian had already walked under the flowering trees and to her side. He lowered his head to look at the undulating strings like waves. Suddenly he said, "People call me a scholar, but I actually know nothing about music. I'm afraid the thoughts you used for me are like playing the lute to a cow." Li Yunrui had probably never heard of playing the lute to a cow. She continued to lower her head and stroke the strings, intoxicated and unconcerned. She didn't know who she was playing this song to. It just so happened that Fan Xian had come to Taiping at this time. Fan Xian was thick-skinned and never knew what bashfulness was. Seeing that she was ignoring him, he smiled self-mockingly and sat down beside the eldest princess. He then looked at the side of her face and said very naturally, "Yi Zhong has betrayed us." The sound of the zither suddenly became chaotic. With a muffled hum, it rose in spirals and spread through the green hills and flowering trees by the lake. The zither struggled, and 3 of them broke. The eldest princess slowly raised her head and looked into Fan Xian's eyes. It only took a moment for her to recover her calm emotions. She said, "Every time I see you, it seems that I don't hear any good news." Although the eldest princess and Fan Xian had stood on their own sides and endlessly fought and clashed, their struggle ran through the major events of the Qing court these few years. Strangely enough, Fan Xian and she had only seen each other a few times. This pair had become each other's greatest enemies, but they were actually not very familiar with each other. "If you want to hear good news, then following the good news should be my head," Fan Xian said quietly to the eldest princess. Fan Xian spoke quietly to the eldest princess. His gaze casually swept around. Unfortunately, he did not discover anything. His gaze dimmed slightly for a moment. At this time, the eldest princess's hands were quietly stroking the broken strings of the zither. Her eyes were slightly closed, and her originally extremely pale complexion seemed even whiter at this moment, even becoming transparent. The usual alluring blush was nowhere to be seen. Fan Xian's sudden appearance in Taiping courtyard was indeed beyond her expectations. This was because Fan Xian had moved too quickly. The people she had left in the rebel army had not had time to report the specific situation in Jingdo. She had already faintly sensed that something was wrong, so she didn't attack Fan Xian at the first opportunity. Instead, she had him come in and see how the latter half of the story happened. Furthermore, she held Fan Xian's life in her hands, so she didn't care at all what kind of extraordinary abilities this son-in-law had. However, Fan Xian's 4 consecutive facts made the eldest princess's state of mind finally relax. Although she had guessed Yan Xiaoyi's death long after Fan Xian had appeared in Jingdo, she couldn't help but feel slightly gloomy now that she had personally confirmed it. After all, this governor had always been her trusted aide. She had raised him single-handedly and was loyal to her. Qin Hang and Qin Ye's deaths also made the eldest princess's heart palpitate. She had not thought that the situation in Jingdo would develop like this. Fan Xian's last sentence revealed all the answers and finally made her angry. After only being angry for a moment, the eldest princess had already calmed down. She opened her eyes. Her lips exhaled like orchids, but there was a faint sorrow. "Yet you still came to beg me. Since I have come, You can guess what has happened in Jingdo. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and sat naturally by the eldest princess's side. He and the eldest princess knew each other well. The reason he dared to enter the courtyard alone and the eldest princess let him in was because they each held the other's life in their hands. Neither wanted to, at the first opportunity, cut off all possibilities. The eldest princess had captured Wan and Dabao, and Fan Xian had already obtained an irreversible advantage in Jingdo. Li Yunrui suddenly lowered her head. Her wide sleeves covered the broken string zither. Her light-colored clothing trembled slightly under the movement of her shoulders. She appeared very pitiful. "I have come to beg you," Fan Xian said sincerely. "Let it go." Hearing the words "let it go," Li Yunrui suddenly raised her head and looked at Fan Xian with an indifferent gaze. She didn't say a word. Although her gaze was indifferent, Fan Xian saw a bone-deep resentment in it. However, this resentment was clearly not directed at him. Instead, it was directed at someone who had seen through him and was directed at someone who was not present. "Let it go? What right do you have to say these words to me?" Li Yunrui smiled slightly mockingly and picked up a faint flower petal from her shoulder. "For Yi Zhong to betray. This has indeed exceeded my expectations. However, since you have come, what do I have to worry about? Perhaps many people are afraid of your martial power, your brain, and the Overwatch Council. But from the beginning, only I have never worried about your existence." Fan Xian was silent. "Everyone thinks that under your glamorous appearance, you are ruthless." The eldest princess looked at him with slight mockery. "It has to be said, your disguise in the Overwatch Council these years has been very good. You made people think that at a critical juncture of great interest, you could transform into a person who would not recognize family. But I know that you were never like that. So you captured Wan and Dabao and did not let them go for even a moment." Fan Xian cut off her words. "2 years ago, I said that you appear powerful, but in reality, you cannot withstand a single blow," Li Yunrui slowly said. "You care about too many people in this world. Your entire body is a lifeline. If I randomly grab one of them, you won't be able to turn things around. Otherwise, why would you not stay in Jingdo right now? Why would you sneak over to me?" Fan Xian lowered his head. A moment later he faintly said, "I have to admit, you are very good at reading people. I care about too many people. This makes it very inconvenient for me to do things. Using Wan as an example, you can use your own daughter's life to threaten your son-in-law, but I cannot. On the contrary, for Wan's life, I am willing to give up my life. I have suffered like this every night these 10 days. In the end, I still have to admit this." Hearing these words, a faint light rose to the eldest princess' slightly lowered eyelids. Fan Xian gazed calmly at the smooth surface of the lake and the slowly flowing flower petals. Calmly he said, "But being willing to give up my life and being threatened by someone are two different concepts. If Wan is sick and needs my head to treat her illness, perhaps I will also cut it off. But if my death is of no benefit to Wan's safety, why would I do such a thing?" He turned his head to look at her and said, "I came today to ask you to understand that it is useless to threaten me. Of course we can talk about how this matter can end well. I care about many people. My entire body is a lifeline." Before the eldest princess opened her mouth, Fan Xian blocked the last opening. "But because there are many lifelines, it is no longer a lifeline. I can't turn around and attack again for Wan. If that happened, what would happen to my father? What would happen to the eldest and third brothers? They are all family. Naturally, it is impossible to distinguish the importance. Presumably, Wan would agree with my view and actions." The eldest princess couldn't help but smile slightly and shake her head. Fan Xian's words had already blocked off all avenues of her threat. Although she could still try, her thoughts had long floated elsewhere. Faintly she sighed and said, "The eldest and third brothers, it looks like you have finally admitted your identity. The men of the Li family are always so hypocritical and shameless. What good is there in saying so much? It's nothing more than forcing me to make things difficult. Then, you can comfort yourself that the deaths of Wan and that idiot have nothing to do with you. You were just forced to do it. Because of family and righteousness, you could only watch without lifting a finger. The one without conscience is me. After the matter is sad, the one comforted by thousands is you." She gazed at Fan Xian's face and smiled slightly. Don't you think you are very shameless? She paused and then said self-mockingly, in this aspect, you are very similar to your father. The father she was talking about was, naturally, the emperor. Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then said, to have the intention to do evil and hide it is shameless. I was forced by you until I had no choice. In the depths of my heart, I don't want anything to happen to Wan. The two people's negotiations had reached an impasse. At this moment, Fan Xian could kill the eldest princess at will. However, there was still no trace of Wan and Dabao. They were probably being watched by Xinyang aces in some corner. If Fan Xian acted, the first to die would probably be Wan. Fan Xian's expression was calm, but he began to worry in the depths of his heart. Faced with such a despairing young woman, he was unable to give her anything she wanted. What should he do next? The eldest princess's expression became serious. It was the complete opposite of her beautiful appearance and peaceful makeup. She gazed dazedly at the surface of the lake and said, I said earlier that the men of the Li family are shameless. It was not wrong. The emperor did not kill me in Guangxin Palace last time because he gave me a chance. On one hand, it was in accordance with his wishes. On the other hand, he could kill me justifiably and not have to worry about how this journey would be described in the history books. She looked at Fan Xian and calmly said, he has never truly cared for me as a sister. Since he confidently gave me this chance, I will certainly give him a great surprise. In Fan Xian's opinion, the emperor's trip to Dong Mountain to worship heaven had indeed taken a great risk. Furthermore, he had completely underestimated the eldest princess's methods. To be able to invite two great grandmasters from a foreign country to move the rebel army to surround the capital, such powerful persuasive and organizational skills, and such a large plan were truly difficult to imagine that such a weak woman could shoulder it alone. However, Yi Zhong's strike also made Fan Xian understand one thing. The eldest princess had laid out a large plan, but the emperor had laid out an even larger plan. The only people who could completely destroy the eldest princess were her brother or that strange old cripple in this matter. And Ji, I want to ask you a question, the eldest princess suddenly said. In the past, I have also tried to repair our relationship, but why have you always pulled your hands behind your back? Before Fan Xian could reply, Li Yunrui spoke first and lightly. Don't say it's because I once tried to kill you or because some of your trusted aides died at my hands. You and I both know what kind of person you are. Perhaps you are loyal to your family and friends, but it doesn't mean you are a hot-blooded man. Fan Xian was silent. A moment later he said, so it's very simple. You won't retreat, and the emperor will not accept us becoming close. In reality, he didn't want to talk about the past with the eldest princess. However, the eldest princess had strangled his lifeline, so he could only feign civility. However, the eldest princess did not seem to be looking back at the past at a loss after her grand plan had failed. Fan Xian's heart jumped. He stared into the eldest princess's eyes. She lowered her head slightly and said, don't misunderstand. I have no desire to join hands with you again. Regardless of whether Brother Emperor lives or dies, I don't have much interest in this world. Fan Xian suddenly realized that her expression was very bleak. Brother is indeed still the most powerful person in the world. Li Yunrui suddenly smiled slightly. I made a big mistake. I thought he only wanted to use the Dong Mountain heaven worship to draw out Uncle Lu Yun to kill him. I didn't expect him to have such a powerful ambition. It looks like these dozen years of keeping a low profile and enduring has made it difficult for him to endure the loneliness. Fan Xian's entry into the garden brought her endless grievous news. Given the eldest princess's genius at scheming, she guessed the truth of Dong Mountain in the shortest amount of time. She guessed the emperor's intentions and understood why she hadn't received any news from Dong Mountain Road in 5 days. Don't think that just because news from Dong Mountain Road has been sealed, it means that Brother Emperor is still alive. The eldest princess closed her eyes slightly and faintly said, that old cripple can also do this. I'm afraid the situation on Dong Mountain is not what you hope for. Since Yi Zhong has taken action, Great Grandmaster Lu Yun will also take action, Fan Xian said with his head lowered. An expression of seeing through everything rose to the eldest princess's face. Lightly she said, although Siga Jian and Ku he believe Yi Lu Yun is one of my people, how could those two strange creatures so easily believe a person of Qing Kingdom? Li Yunrui's eyes narrowed, but there was no sense of cold killing intent. There was only indifference and indifference. You and Brother Emperor seem to have both thought of one thing wrong. After all, I am a person of Qing Kingdom. My entire life has been spent on how to help Brother unify the world. How could I not take into account the dangers that the Qing Kingdom would face in the future when I was about to leave? I have never underestimated Brother. I believe that even in desperate straits, he would still have a miraculous hand to turn the tables. I just didn't think that his miraculous hand would be Uncle Lu Yun. But from the beginning, I had never thought of letting Ku He and Sigu Jian return alive. The 4 great grandmasters will be at Dong Mountain. Even if Uncle Lu Yun takes action, it will only be a 2-on-2 situation. What kind of people are Ku He and Sigu Jian? If Brother Emperor wants to kill the 2 great grandmasters just like this, his thinking is a bit too simple. I trust Brother, so I believe that even if he dies, he will drag the 2 great grandmasters down with him. Otherwise, how could they be worthy of his intelligence and power? The eldest princess said indifferently. At that time, even if the Qing Kingdom has Uncle Lu Yun, Northern Qi and Dongyi will have no one to support them. What is so strange about the current development of the situation? If Uncle Lu Yun takes action and the 4 great grandmasters are completely destroyed, it is no different from what I think. Strange creatures like great grandmasters should not exist in this world. If there were no great grandmasters, given the military power of the Qing Kingdom, we would have long unified the world. Why would we wait until today? No matter what happens on Dong Mountain, it will be of great benefit to the Qing Kingdom. The 4 great grandmasters will go to Dong Mountain. Once they all die, with that kind of momentum, do you think the emperor will be lucky enough to survive? Without allowing Fan Xian to speak, the eldest princess coldly threw out each sentence, making Fan Xian's lips go dry. He didn't know how to respond. He had not thought that from the beginning. The eldest princess had never thought about the great grandmasters on Dong Mountain being able to survive. However, she was not an immortal and couldn't calculate all the details. However, the development of the situation did not seem to be too far from what she had expected. The only variable had appeared in Jingdo. He had left Dong Mountain alive and Yi Zhong's strike. If the 4 old men die with Brother Emperor, do you think I care? Do you think I care who sits on the throne? Even if you control Jingdo and Chengqian's inability to ascend makes me disappointed, what do these small setbacks count for? The eldest princess glanced at Fan Xian and mockingly said, of the emperor's 5 sons, other than the 3rd prince who is still young, the other 4, even the most useless 2nd prince, can lead the Qing Kingdom to conquer the world. Use the 4 great grandmasters to accompany the emperor in death. A proud and crazy glow rose to the eldest princess's face. Presumably, he will be satisfied with having 4 guards like this in the netherworld. If I then gift his son a great world, I can say I have not let him down. What about you? Fan Xian asked in a raspy voice. Only now did he truly understand why his father and Chen Pingping kept saying by his ear that this woman was crazy. Indeed, after creating such a big mess, she didn't care at all who could survive to the end in the battle in Jingdo or sit on the throne. In any case, they were all children of the Li family and the emperor's sons. Me. The eldest princess looked at her son-in-law like she was looking at an idiot and faintly said, the rough soil on the ground or the dazzling shooting star in the world, which one do you want to be? In life, one only needs to release the light that belongs to oneself. Human words are not to be feared, and history books are not to be feared. Someone like Brother Emperor who likes face will, in the end, need my help. Although he knew that he had single-handedly caused the eldest princess and the emperor's final break, Fan Xian still couldn't resist asking in a raspy voice. But, why did you do this? The question was vague, but the eldest princess heard it clearly. Glancing at the quiet and simple scenery of Taiping Courtyard, she slowly said, because he betrayed me. Because I wanted to prove to everyone that a woman can also change the many years of history that these stinky men have dominated. She slowly stood. Flower petals slid down from her body. She looked very beautiful. Fan Xian listened to these words in a daze, particularly the last sentence. He had heard it in Guangxin Palace. It appeared to be ear-piercing and shocking. Li Yunrui used a greedy gaze to glance at the scenery of Taiping Courtyard. In a low voice she said reluctantly, when I was little, I liked this courtyard, but brother always wouldn't let me come. Later, when I asked father for it, I was scolded by brother. At that time, the mistress of this courtyard was very tyrannical. She smiled slightly and spun her body, causing the nearby trees to tremble slightly. A dozen more flower petals fell. She looked at Fan Xian and said in a soft and charming voice, "Tell me, do you think I finally won against your mother?" Fan Xian had long sunk into a strange emotion. Suddenly hearing these words, he didn't know how to respond. He could only smile bitterly again and again. The eldest princess stepped on her bare feet and slowly danced on the green grass. She carried a gentle, relaxed, and joyful emotion. Looking at this scene, for some reason, Fan Xian felt an incomparable anger in his heart. Yes, you all stood higher than everyone else and saw further than everyone else. Regardless of whether it was the emperor or Li Yunrui, their gazes were never on Jingdo from the beginning. Instead, they were fixed on Dong Mountain and the 4 great grandmasters who should not have existed in this world. How many people died? How many families were destroyed in Jingdo? How many soldiers of the Qing kingdom have lost their heads and lost their lives because they wanted to leave their names in the annals of history? How many people cried bitterly and grieved? "You are not as good as her," Fan Xian suddenly said. The eldest princess's bare feet suddenly stopped on the grass. She turned her head and looked at Fan Xian with a cold gaze. It was as if she was waiting for him to give an explanation. Fan Xian raised his brows and continued to sit on the ground. With slight mockery he said, "When my mother came into this world, she could at least make the Qing people laugh. You can only make the people of the world cry." Li Yunrui smiled faintly and revealed a mocking expression. She was not moved at all. However, Fan Xian's following words made her angry. Fan Xian shook his head and said in a matter-of-fact tone, "I've seen my mother's portrait. I have to say, she was prettier than you." Fan Xian smiled. "Everyone loves Yi Qingmei, isn't that so?" He stood up and patted the grass off his butt, not looking at Li Yunrui's expression. Since he knew that the eldest princess had the will to die at the beginning of her plan, and only hoped for the last bit of glory in the world before going to the underworld to find her lover, Fan Xian was tired. He only wanted to provoke her, create a variable, and find a way to save Wan and Dabao. Of course, there was still a gargantuan doubt circling around his heart. Would the emperor be able to survive in the turbulence of the Grandmaster's battle? Chapter 575. If time was a clock that could be accurately calculated and could be controlled at will, then let us follow the clock in the scene of passing through time and start moving in the opposite direction, returning to the time of the Great Dong Mountain. Let us see the drenched yellow robe, the burning sword, the middle-aged man the tip of the sword pointed at, and countless people in the rain. Then, the second hand gently struggled, bounced, and passed the first grid. Following Sigu Jian's finger, the long sword that had been floating in the air suddenly flew out. Circling around his body in a semicircle, it pierced straight toward the Qing Emperor's back. Yi Luyun had already come to the Qing Emperor's side and stretched out his pure white hands that were like metal and stone. The sword had already pierced through the air and tore through the thick yuanqi that might or might not have existed on Dong Mountain. In the next second, it seemed like it was going to pierce into the Emperor's back. However, that pair of pure white and even somewhat childish hands exceeded everyone's expectations as they gently pressed towards the sword. The situation of the great grandmaster surrounding and killing the Qing Emperor on Dong Mountain finally underwent a shocking change. Yi Luyun attacked the sword and not the emperor. The first thing that came into contact with this killing sword was Yi Luyun's sleeve. The wide sleeves were woven from linen. In that instant, they became extremely soft. They were like the clouds that often floated on the mountainside of Dong Mountain when there was no rain. They softly wrapped around the rapidly flying sword in layers. The strands of clouds snapped, and the hemp sleeves shattered into butterflies that danced on the summit of Dong Mountain. The sword, on the other hand, had expended its essence in such a gentle entanglement. The coldness and killing intent it carried suddenly disappeared. It became a piece of scrap metal, dim, lightless, and very petty. The power of this sword was too vicious and severe. After Yi Luyun recited a verse, he had no choice but to come out and protect the emperor's safety. However, when he revealed his true position, he was unable to find the most critical point to carry out an ambush. How should he deal with the following situation? Yi Luyun's white beard was soaked by the rain, but his eyes looked seriously at the sword in his hand. He did not feel any contempt because of the sword's dimness. He also did not feel any unease because he had been forced to attack early and was unable to kill Sigu Jian. He just looked at the sword seriously and held it in his hand. It was as if this ordinary sword contained countless ghosts and gods that would come out at any moment and devour everyone on the mountaintop. His hands, which were as steady as jade, formed an illusory circle. The mouth of his thumb and index finger turned into a circle. The silent and lightless heavenly sword abruptly stood motionless in midair. He was a great grandmaster, so he knew that all of Sigu Jian's sword intent was contained in this sword. If he still did not act, the body of the sword would completely pierce into the emperor's body. He had wandered the 4 seas for many years for this moment. However, he had been forced to act early. Sigu Jian was not truly an idiot. Just as the eldest princess had expected, although he had not expected Yi Luyun to stand on the Qing emperor's side, these 2 great grandmasters of northern Qi and Dongyi had the deepest understanding of the Qing people's sinister and cunning. Until the last moment, they would not allow themselves to sink into danger. The short body wearing the straw hat actually contained the wisdom of a great grandmaster that was completely different from his reputation in history. He only used this sword outside his body to break the Qing emperor's plan and force out the true killer on Dong Mountain, Yi Luyun. Just as Yi Luyun stood in front of the Qing emperor like a bright sun with his hands in a circle, forcefully suppressing the sharp sword, Sigu Jian's body began to tremble. The hemp clothing on his body shook violently like it had been struck by lightning. His sword had already flown into the air and stopped between Yi Luyun's steady hands. Following the shaking of his body, a startling sword intent pierced through the hemp clothing he wore and shot into the sky. Summoned by this sword intent, the sword Yi Luyun's bare hands controlled also began to tremble violently. It buzzed in the air and shone with light again. The rain continued to pour down on Dong Mountain. In such a short period of time, the raindrops seemed to be moving at a strangely slow speed, delicately sensing the attractive force of the earth. They no longer fell in a torrential downpour. Instead, they were like sparkling and translucent pearls. Behind the heavy curtain of pearls and jade, the short man in hemp clothing used his body as a sword. His momentum broke through the heavens and the earth. Just like that, he traversed more than 100 feet and arrived in front of Yi Luyun like a bolt of lightning. He stretched out his hand and pressed down on the ordinary sword that he had worn by his side for decades. Sigu Jian's hand once again gripped his sword. The tip of the sword spat out wildly like a silver snake dancing chaotically with an imposing aura. Just as the still curtain of rain was forcefully broken through by the hemp-clothed Sigu Jian, Yi Luyun's eyes abruptly shone with a bright light. Like a flowing cloud enveloping the sun, he forcefully absorbed the sun's energy. With a muffled grunt, his 2 palms, which had formed a circle, came together inwards. With a crisp clap, the empty air was like solid metal. A moment later, it was forcefully crushed by this pair of pure white hands and merged with the body of the sword. For a great grandmaster, there were no traps. Even though the Qing emperor had set up a trap and hidden Yi Luyun until the end, Sigu Jian had still easily pierced through the layers of fog with one strike. Immediately after, Sigu Jian used this great opportunity to pour all of his sword power back into the sword. To Yi Luyun's side was the Qing emperor. Faced with this swift and fierce strike, he could not dodge it. He could only use the cloud hand to forcefully block it. However, when the endless sword power was matched against the physical body, Yi Luyun could not use his Sanzhou techniques to his heart's content. Sigu Jian had seized this opportunity. In a battle between great grandmasters, the occasional thought could change the color of heaven and earth. It only needed a slight shift for the situation to shift. Sigu Jian cried out shrilly and crazily. All of the ruthless sword qi in his body surged into the sword in his hand. The speed at which the sword qi surged was so fast that the hilt of the sword in his hand suddenly became hot. With a whoosh, it evaporated all of the water on the grass rope. The terrifying sound of metal scraping against stone rang out. The long sword between Yi Luyun's tightly clasped hands advanced an inch. Yi Luyun's head remained slightly lowered. The wide sleeves on his arms had long become butterflies dancing in the air around him. The most stable pair of arms in the world held the sword tightly between them. A moment later, the skin on his hands began to crack inch by inch. It was like a patient who had contracted some kind of skin disease. The skin aged, and the edges curled up. It looked like the land during the drought in the 5th year of the Qing calendar, cracking open. It was strangely terrifying and miraculous. His eyes were filled with a calm gaze as he watched the sword in his hands inch closer to his body. He did not reveal a glimmer of emotion. He only spat out one word. Cloud. Following this word, the two arms, whose skin had already cracked open by the supreme sword Qi, abruptly became soft. They were deeper than the ocean, softer than lake water, and purer than the eyes of a Jiangnan woman. They were the clouds in the sky. Strands of the clouds were like longing. Strand by strand, they were tied to the startling sword. It made the extremely powerful sword suddenly meet with gentleness and had no choice but to temporarily stop along the way. In this short second, the heavens, in good humor, bestowed a bolt of lightning that lit up the particularly dark mountaintop covered by dark clouds. The lightning lit up Sigu Jian's face under his bamboo hat. His eyes were filled with a wild aura like that of a wild beast. He didn't say a single word. He only howled shrilly. The howl echoed through Dong Mountain and knocked countless people unconscious. He was a great grandmaster who used the sword. He used the Sigu sword. He focused on what was in front and disregarded what was behind, pressing forward with an indomitable will. The power of the sword surged out along with the howl. The rising ruthlessness could not be stopped. Boundless murderous intent and ruthless aura were all in this strike. This was the most powerful strike Sigu Jian had made since he was born. It was a strike formed from his entire life, spirit, and belief. The power of the sword was swift and ruthless. It already had traces of being heaven-defying. On this land, no one had ever made such a strike before. There probably wouldn't be one in the future. No one could stop it. Not even Yi Luyun. In a situation, it was often difficult to distinguish between the people in the situation and the people outside the situation. The people who planned to win often only realized in the moment things ended that no matter how they had schemed against themselves and ruined their lives. The development of things would always drift further and further away from the original plans of those in control. If he had known everything that had happened in the second when the clock stopped, perhaps the Qing Emperor would have chosen to gather the tiger guards on the mountain at the very beginning and have the Qing kingdom's two great grandmasters face off against Ku He and Sigu Jian. With Wu Zhu at the side, he could have swung his knife after the 100 tiger guards were mutually wounded. How could the situation now have occurred? In the most important day of Sigu Jian's life, he perfectly demonstrated the wisdom and decisiveness of a great grandmaster. He only used one strike to force Yi Luyun out. He also perfectly used the Qing Emperor's plan and the Qing Emperor's life to force Yi Luyun into a hopeless situation. If Sigu Jian had not used up some of his energy when he was climbing the stairs to heaven on Dong Mountain to kill the 100 tiger guards with one strike, perhaps that startling strike would have long pierced into Yi Luyun's abdomen. Of course, if he had not used the fresh blood of 100 Qing aces as a sacrifice to this sword to accumulate boundless bloody killing intent, perhaps Sigu Jian would not have been able to use such a heartless and ruthless strike. Yi Luyun had 3 ways to deal with this strike. Just like the last of the 36 stratagems in that world, when the situation had developed to an extreme, the best method was often the simplest method. Given this Qing Great Grandmaster's peerless movements and Luyun San's Ho, when faced with Sigu Jian's startling strike, he could have chosen to retreat and escape. He could have used the San's Ho Sea of Clouds to temporarily seal the edge of the sword for a moment. He only needed a moment to leave the area enveloped by the sword power. However, the Emperor was by his side. If he dodged, the Emperor would probably be turned into a sky full of minced meat under this heavenly sword. Thus, Yi Luyun did not dodge. At this moment, he was already unable to dodge. Wu Zhu, who had been standing silently at the door of the old temple, lowered his head. At some point, his hand had once again landed on the handle of the metal drill by his waist. The Emperor's life was on the line, but he still did not act. In the last-minute moment of this second, a slight smile suddenly flashed across Yi Luyun's crude face. It appeared particularly strange for this smile to appear at such a moment. A portion of the cloud-like hands was suddenly blown away by the wind on the summit of the mountain. It swept up and headed straight for Sigu Jian's face. Before the cloud arrived, the straw hat had already flown far away. The strong wind hit his face and blew directly at Sigu Jian's face. Since he could not block this strike, then why should he? Yi Luyun chose to remove one hand and spread out a patch of cloud to cover Sigu Jian's face. This was what low-level martial artists were best at, besieging the enemy to rescue the besieged. However, in the hands of this great grandmaster, it appeared free and at ease, leaving and leaving as he wished. It was a patch of cloud on the horizon. Following the ruthless and soaring sword intent, it gently and quickly floated towards Sigu Jian's face. If Sigu Jian ignored the Sansho and the long sword pierced into Yi Liuyun's abdomen, with the sword intent and murderous aura contained in the sword, it could instantly shred Yi Liuyun's organs to pieces. Even if Yi Liuyun luckily survived, he would no longer have any ability to fight. If he wanted to avoid this Sansho, with just a thought, a gap would naturally appear in the spirit that poured into the sword. How could an imperfect and ruthless swordsmanship stab a great grandmaster under the sword? Yi Liuyun's choice at this moment was very wise. It could even be said to be wonderful. He knew that his cloud could not heavily injure Sigu Jian, but he forced Sigu Jian to make a choice in such a short amount of time. He used his life to gamble on Sigu Jian's heavy injury. He could clearly sense that Sigu Jian had already advanced into a realm of absolute killing. However, there was still Wu Zhu, Eunuch Yao, and everyone else at the summit. Yi Liuyun could die, but Sigu Jian could not be heavily injured. A heavily injured Sigu Jian could not guarantee that he could kill the Qing emperor. Such an outcome was something Sigu Jian could not accept. Thus, his cloud flew out and waited for Sigu Jian to change his sword. But Sigu Jian did not change his sword. A wild aura continued to shine through his eyes. His black hair danced wildly in the mountain wind. He looked like a demon holding a sword. His aura was intimidating. The long sword continued to press toward Yi Liuyun with an indomitable will. His left hand, however, was empty, pointing diagonally to the left. He didn't pay any attention to the cloud that was rushing towards him at all. There were tens of thousands of sword techniques in the world, but there was only one way to hold a sword. Sigu Jian's left hand was in the most standard way to hold a sword. The space between his thumb and forefingers was empty. Suddenly, a weak sword intent seeped out from the emptiness. Although it was weak, it was unusually easy to kill the bright yellow figure that the empty sword in his left hand pointed toward. Yi Liuyun attacked Sigu Jian and had no choice but to save him. Sigu Jian held the hilt of his sword and used sword intent to break through the air to counterattack Yi Liuyun. You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.